Hello and welcome to a Conquest, the Last Argument of Kings event list analysis and critique. Today we're going to be looking at all 16 lists that will be played at the upcoming Road to Chios 2024 World Championship, the first round of which is happening on September the 24th, not far out from the recording of this video. Now, I do imagine most people watching this video will be familiar with the Road to Chios, but in case you're not, it's Parabellum's premier Worlds event. All 16 players who have received invites won those invitations by playing in multiple Worlds event inside their regions over the course of the last year, which accumulated world points, which translated into an invitation. And this means that I want to start the video with a really significant caveat. Every single person going to Road to Chios is a very good, experienced player who has played in multiple events. And that means that even though I have the luxury of sitting down this evening and going through their lists and analyzing and critiquing them, they probably know more about their lists than I do. They have been training for this list, they have been preparing, they have been honing these lists for some time now because players have known that they've had an invite for long enough to really put the yards in and practice and refine. There's a lengthy period during which I believe the players knew what scenarios would be played and that they had an invitation. And so, therefore, every one of these lists has had a lot of thought put into it. So, even though I'm going to be sitting down and perhaps applying some critique to them, just bear in mind that the players who wrote these know what they are doing. This is not just a regular event where people of all different skills from all walks of life has turned up. Everyone here is a championship competitor. And so, with a big congratulations already to everyone who is going, to everyone who has earned their spot or earned an invitation, let's jump first into the scenarios that we played at the Road to Chios and then into the lists proper. Now, to set the scene for the list that we're about to see and the event itself, Road to Chios will be playing 4 of these 6 scenarios. There are 12 scenarios in the Conquest official tournament scenario pack. And for this event, the event organizers have selected 6 of them, from which a pool of 4 will be generated for the event as the event plays. So players don't know exactly which 4 they will be playing, just they will be playing 4 of these 6, and these 6 represent a pretty varied suite of scenarios. To run through them very briefly, the first, Echelon has 2 large zones which are worth points for holding, and then 4 objectives, 3 of which can be destroyed by any one player to secure points. Echelon has no points awarded for killing enemy characters, regiments, or warlords, which means that it is very much about both the objectives and the zones. It's possible to have very close scoring in Echelon, where the tiebreak really is just whoever either breaks through to their opposing zone just for one round even, or secures more objectives, and generally you will see deployment in Echelon occur with both players moving up towards their more easily secured zone, perhaps making a token attempt to contest for a single turn, and then otherwise a line of engagement tending to be drawn along the diagonal of the table, with the 2 zones basically representing the home turf and pushes being made into your opponent's space. Now, that's not always the case. Obviously, scenarios can be approached in a variety of different ways. You can have very messy or very orderly engagements, but that's basically how this works, and therefore the kind of army that Echelon favors is an army that can play that kind of game. Next up, we have Forlorn Hope, which has 2 objectives which can be destroyed by either players, 4 points, and 4 zones, which can be controlled by any player, 4 points. There are kill points in this scenario, but only for characters, not for regiments or warlords. Now, the alignment of the objective zones in Fallen Hope tends to produce quite distinct games where you have lanes that you are pushing backwards and forwards. You'll obviously have 2 objectives that are closest to your side of the table, which you can claim quickly, and your opponent can do the same on their side of the table, which will very quickly produce a deployment where these players are pushing basically up these lanes toward the opposing zone to try and contest or seize the opposing space. One of the things that's interesting about Fallen Hope is that even though it doesn't naturally lead itself to a Horns of the Bull style deployment where you have heavily weighted flanks because there's no objectives there to secure, there is still plenty of space in which flanking models can maneuver and play. So you can have a strong center, but if you have an army that makes good use of flankers, they can absolutely still use that space on the side of the table to move around, not claim territory, move around and secure attacking vectors that your opponent may have to leave their flanks exposed against because so much of your force tends to be concentrated in that more central part of the table. Now, by contrast, the third of 6 scenarios is Melee, which is very much a do-everything kind of scenario. It has 4 objective zones. The small ones are worth the least, the large ones are worth the most, but it's all worth points. And it has kill points for regiments and characters and warlords. What this means is that melee tends to be a scenario that can actually be approached in quite a lot of different ways because there are a lot of different paths to secure points, means you can deploy in a variety of different ways. And my experience personally is that more often than not, it is terrain that tends to dictate how deployment occurs in this scenario. You can definitely deploy in a Horns of the Bull style, where you push up on the flanks, you use the table edge to secure one flank, you push your force in more toward the center of the table from those flank positions. You've got a nice protected advance, which will instantly move you toward the two most valuable scenario zones. But by comparison, if there is impassable terrain or terrain that is difficult to maneuver through or around, you can end up deploying basically in a way that allows you to maintain a cohesive and concentrated force, just acknowledging that you are being dictated by the terrain. There are a lot of different ways to play melee, there are a lot of different approaches that you can take, provided your army can, in some capacity, reach approximately the center of the table and fight a meaningful battle there. It's one of the most rounded scenarios, has a lot of different approaches, could be played a lot of different ways. Next up, the fourth of six, and probably the only scenario that I was surprised to see on this list, is Foresight. Now, Foresight has 5 zones. Points are all just for securing zones. There are no kill points and there are no objectives. Foresight, I'm surprised to see because it's a scenario with a mini game. You'll see that those zones are numbered. The central zone does not have a number, but the others are numbered 1, 2, 3, and 4. At the beginning of each round, as part of the beginning of round stamp, players will secretly select a zone to turn off. That zone is worth nothing unless both players select it, in which case it's worth double. Now, I have very mixed feelings on this as a scenario. The main reason I'm mixed on it is that introducing that minigame tends to add a couple of minutes to every round. Yeah, at most, sometimes it's less, but usually you'll add like 1.5 to 2 minutes to a round, just as players stop and think and note that down, write it down, set it aside, and then proceed with the turn. Conquest is a 10-round game, which means that if you add even 1.5 minutes to every round, you've added 15 minutes to the course of the game. And when rounds are already 2 hours and 15 minutes, and most players of the caliber of players that are heading to this event should not have any problems at all playing games within 2 hours and 15 minutes, in Foresight, you're effectively playing games within 2 hours. And even very good players, if they're being very heavily pressured, or they're both, for example, playing factions that play more in the late game. Foresight is a scenario where even very good players won't always finish on time. Now, my hope is that since Foresight has been advertised as one of the 6 scenarios, and therefore every player who's going to Chios knows about it and will have had a chance to practice it, that effect will be somewhat mitigated, but it certainly was the scenario that I was most surprised to see show up in this list. In terms of actually playing it, it plays a lot like Melee in terms of the deployment because you have 5 zones spread broadly across the table, which opens up a lot of ground to seize and employ all of your various tactics and your chosen deployment methods, etc., in the process of seizing that territory. Now, unlike Melee, because it doesn't have kill points, it really very much is a scenario that is about those zones. Those zones are how you win the game, and if you can't secure them for long enough to obtain a lead that wins you the game, you can't win Foresight. And this is going to be relevant when we get to some of the lists, including some of the ones that we talk about early. Foresight has the most zones of any scenario. It has 5, and on any given turn, you at least have to act as though all 5 of those zones are potentially live, which means all 5 of those zones need to be scored, and we're going to see some lists that make sacrifices in terms of their ability to score a scenario that wide. Now, much easier to score is the 5th scenario, head-to-head, which has 3 zones and you can only score 2 of them. Head-to-head is a simple scenario, but a personal favorite. It is obviously asymmetric in the sense of there is a zone on the far side of the table that you're trying to reach, a zone in the center. The scenario is symmetric along the horizontal, but not symmetric along the vertical. It has kill points for everything, but most of the time the game will be decided by seizing those zones. You'll tend to have a big scrap on the right side of the flank relative to player 1, where because both players will be attempting to reach that central zone, and then I find more often the left side of the table relative to player 1 is the side of the table where you see gambits happen. Head to head, because that far zone is very difficult to reach but worth a lot of points, there tends to be this game around pushing just enough pressure forward that your opponent has to respond, and then using that response maybe to leverage advantage on the right flank, where the more consistent zone that's easier to reach is. There is a lot of play in terms of allocating your force, telegraphing what it is you're going to be doing, seeing how your opponent responds to that telegraph, and then respond in kind. Another thing that's quite relevant in head-to-head is that it's a scenario, a lot of these are actually, like melee is the same, for example, so is Maelstrom. It's a scenario where the reserve lines can be very relevant. If you can set a very aggressive reinforcement line, particularly if you set a reinforcement line that enables you to maybe make a dash to ward off the flank toward that far zone, you can have some interesting play, but otherwise, head-to-head really is a scenario that encourages just good, solid play, focused around, really heavily focused on the right side of the table, and then with a diffuse focus, a game of feint and parry on the left side of the table, which I like it a lot for that reason. Finally, we have Maelstrom. Of all of these scenarios, Maelstrom, I believe, is the only scenario that can be scored on the first turn. Typically, you can't score turn 1 in any of the tournament pack scenarios, but Maelstrom does say that it can be seized and scored from round 1. In Maelstrom, the zones, the amount that they are worth changes over the course of the game, where very early and very late in the game, the central objective is worth more. In the middle of the game, from rounds 5 to 8, which often is the bulk of the game in which you're actually fighting, the zones on the edges of the table are worth the most. Now, this means that Maelstrom specifically mechanically rewards lists that can score very, very early in the game. There is at least one list, and I think there might only be one list in the entire 16 list we'll be looking at, that can score Maelstrom on turn 1. It can actually score a point in Maelstrom on the first turn, and that is a Spires list. But more generally, I find Maelstrom plays as a game where early scenario advantage actually really matters, because there is no way to rubber band back into Maelstrom. The zones are worth a fixed amount, and you do not get more points for scoring more of them. In a lot of these other scenarios, there are points for zones, and then if you secure a certain number of zones, you get a little bonus. So maybe if there are 4 zones available, and if you score 3 of them, you get a couple of extra points at the end of that turn. What that means is that maybe you fall behind on scenario early, but you do that in pursuit of an attritional advantage, where you grind down and annihilate your opponent's force, you wipe them out, and then you move to secure a number of zones for the last few turns of the game, and those bonus points for securing multiple zones get you over the line and get you the win. That doesn't work in Maelstrom because there's no kill point bonus. You don't get any points for killing your opponent, and you don't get any points for securing multiple zones. You just get the points the zones are worth, and there are relatively fewer points on the table in the final few rounds of the game, as the scoring switches from 2 points for the exterior zones, 1 point to the center, back to 2 points for the center, 1 point for the exterior. So there is one fewer point to be gained every round in rounds 9 and 10. And so this means that Maelstrom is a game where often you can't afford to fall behind, at least not for long. You need to fight and contest and play the game from about as early as you can, if you can, and you need a very clear plan for getting back into the game if you fall behind. You absolutely can still win Maelstrom, right? If you lose a bit of scenario ground early, but then you table your opponent and you seize all of the zones for multiple turns, that's still a path to victory and optional, like a way you can win Maelstrom. But the tipping point where you pass beyond the point of no return trying to pursue that kind of strategy occurs much earlier in Maelstrom, which again makes it a very interesting scenario. Now, with the scenarios covered, the scene set, let's get into these 16 lists. Normally I would do these in alphabetical order. This time around, just so that I don't end up like 2 hours into the video and with nothing left in the tank to talk about W'adrun, we're starting with W'adrun. We're doing these in reverse alphabetical order this time, which means that the first one up is Raymond Tan's W'adrun. Now, Raymond is one of 4 W'adrun players. The factional split in Road to Chios is broadly pretty good, which is to say it's 16 players, Conquest has 8 factions, we have every single faction represented, which is absolutely not something that's guaranteed in a 16-player event when you have 8 factions. But we do have every single faction being played at Road to Chios, albeit only 1 Nords and 1 Spires player. But we have 4 W'adrun players, and I think we have a similar number of city-states. Now, Raymond is running a Scion of Conquest Warlord in a big block of Braves. So that's Braves with 8 stands, nothing special, just a standard bearer, but that is a stonking great block under the War Cult, which will be able to be used to give a bonus cleave, a bonus to defense, a bonus to resolve, and to rally the regiment. And upgrades on the Sign of Conquest are Disorienting Strikes. This is the first thing that I'm going to critique. It's a slightly unusual choice. Now, usually, Disorienting Strikes appears in a list as a tell me you had 10 points spare without telling me you have 10 points spare kind of upgrade. It only applies in duels. It gives just a very small bonus in duels. It's not hugely relevant most of the time. Duels are kind of just a sometimes occurrence in Conquest. And an alternate 10-point upgrade that would be very valuable the entire game would be giving the Scion of Conquest, and therefore his regiment, Indomitable, which basically turns a failed resolve check into a pass once every attack. That kind of ability just mints value and absolutely pays for itself. Over the course of a game, it will usually save an entire stand of Braves at least, because it's going to take 5 attacks to wear that kind of regiment down minimum. So the fact that he's gone with Disorienting Strikes is interesting. If I had to guess, I would say it's probably because this list is running super light on scoring. And so one of the very few weaknesses, well, actually, there are a few weaknesses running very light on scoring, but one of the weaknesses that would not normally be a weakness in a list is the fact that if you decline a duel, your scoring turns off. And so I suspect that Raymond, over the course of testing with this list, has realized that he is running so few scoring units, and in exchange getting lots of lights, lots of early pressure, lots of aggression, he has to be able to accept duels, and therefore the Scion of Conquest is taking Disorienting Strikes to give him a bit of protection in that case. We also have Essence of the Phenopteryx, which increases the range of his spells by a huge amount, which is excellent. In particular, I can't remember which one it's called, but there is a Dispel spell on the Scion of Conquest that allows, once cast, allows him to discard chant markers to turn spells off. Increasing the range of that spell makes a bubble that is effectively ginormous. And there are multiple armies. In particular, there's one Old Dominion list where having that counterspell up could save a huge amount of pain, which makes a Scion of Conquest, Warlord or not, with Essence of the Phenopteryx, really high value. Then we have a Predator, Cult of War, Animalistic Focus. His warband consists of 3 Raptor Riders, 3 Raptor Riders, 3 Slingers, and 3 Slingers. Notable, no upgrades in any of the Slingers. You will sometimes see Wardrune lists where you have a single, like, really pimped out unit of Slingers. Not so here, we're just going kind of wide with an absolute ton of early aggressive pressure. Cult of War is relevant here because although Raptor Riders are very good at putting out a high number of attacks, you need something like the Cult of War to give them cleave, which is what's going to be happening here. Rounding out Raymond's list, we then have a third warband, and this is where our final 2 scoring units appear. A Matriarch Queen with War and Mantle of the Devoted, which means that she can get to Tier 3 War, which gives Blessed, really juices up the defense of the regiment in, oh look, it's another regiment of 8 Braves, and a Tauntaur. So we've got 1 heavy, 2 mediums, and 4 light regiments, which gives us a fairly low activation count of 10 and a fairly elite overall list. Now, there are some very interesting Wardrune lists that we'll be looking at, and this is one of them. Like, I have to point out the obvious issue that this list runs into, which is that it has exactly 3 scoring regiments. There are effects in the game, including on the Scion of Conquest, that can make regiments just not count as scoring, and many of the scenarios that are in Road to Chios will really force you to get onto scenario zones and hold there. And that means that having just 3 scoring regiments presents possibly a really big challenge if you can't secure such an early attritional advantage with your Raptor Riders and your Slingers that you just don't get onto those zones. You don't take that space. You don't secure those points. It also poses the risk in a scenario like, for example, Foresight, that you just have to park a 400-point unit on a zone and sit them there doing nothing for the entire game because your opponent isn't contesting that part of the battlefield, but you can't not be there. Now, Melee and Foresight, to me, are both notable risks in that respect. I think a lot of the other scenarios probably manage a list like this a little bit better. For example, Forlorn Hope, where you're trying to push up lanes. No problem, this kind of list with these big, really big, resilient, fairly dangerous. Like, I wouldn't overestimate the danger of those Braves, but they have dangerous characters in them, and with War they will do damage. but mostly they're very durable. So in that kind of a scenario, this list will pay off, but it is a risky choice to run a list like this into the 6 possible scenarios that Road to Chios is presenting. Now, another risk this list is taking that I think is worth calling out is that those like Braves in those numbers, right? That is 40 wounds of Braves. That's durable. With the war chant up, giving them a bonus to defense, a bonus to resolve, auto rallying them, giving them cleave, etc., their durability goes even further. They're often going to be effectively resolve 6 and completely fearless. Their resolve bonuses will be so high. And defense 4 especially is a pretty significant breakpoint for making all of those wounds really go a really long distance, even before we get to like the Matriarch Queen's healing. But you need to activate the regiment to chant. You don't just start the turn with those bonuses active. And although it is actually possible to chain straight up Braves into Braves and have at least basic defensive bonuses, you'd have to give up Blessed to do that. But if you've got some tokens in the bank at the end of your turn, then you move directly into the Sign of Conquest's Braves, and then you move directly into the Fanatic Braves that the Matriarch Queen is leading. You can actually, in the first 2 activations, just get all of your you can flexibly get all of your war buffs up, right? If you don't do that, then you have to chain character into regiment, which is totally fine, but that sets the order in which you're applying your defensive buffs, which if you guess wrong is potentially exploitable by your opponent. And if you don't go first, there are risks with relying on those kind of defensive buffs. You are not necessarily, but you're straitjacketing your turn order a little bit. You will have a fairly predictable turn order, and you have an exploitable turn order. Now, if you can get your defenses up in time, and because this list has only 10 activations, 10 cards in its command stack absolute maximum, it will often, 2/3 of the time, be going first if it chooses to do so. It'll often be able to address that weakness, but it is just something to note. In exchange for all of that, this list punches. It's got really big blocks, it's got characters that are dangerous, it's got sustain, it's got good spell, like utility spellcasting, and it has a ton of early light pressure, including the ability to very effectively destroy objectives. Between slingers and raptor riders, you'll be able to go after objectives quite quickly and easily. In the 2 scenarios where objectives are present, that can actually be quite decisive. So overall, I would rate Raymond as taking risks with this list, but it's an interesting list, and apart from disorienting strikes, which under normal circumstances I would say should absolutely be indomitable, but in this specific list I can kind of see the argument for it. Also just very well apportioned, very well appointed. There are no superfluous upgrades. There's nothing that I'm like, oh, why did you spend points on that? It all makes a lot of sense. It's very clean and very clear. Next up in our Wardrune lists, we have a person whose name I am going to mispronounce. Uh, I believe it's pronounced Pavel, but I am not certain about that at all. But I'm going to just say Pavel, and then I'm not going to try and pronounce Pavel's last name. Like some Polish last names, it's kind of given up on the idea of vowels. Now, before we break down everything that's in this list, this is a list that has taken the idea of action economy, which Dungeons and Dragons players may be familiar with, and decided that they would like all of it, please. I I don't know necessarily how good this list is, but it is super cool, and I suspect it's got some serious legs. So we'll just go through all of the individual units, and then we'll talk a little bit about what it's trying to do. So it is starting with a Matriarch Queen Warlord, which in this instance is an important choice going all in on the bit. Now, the Matriarch Queen's Warlord ability does 2 things. It allows her to resolve 2 draw events a turn, and it gives her the draw event the Matriarch walks, which allows her to bestow the Fanatic rule on a friendly infantry regiment within, I think, 8 inches. She's got Voice of Conquest, which means that the regiment she joins counts as belonging to the Cult of Conquest, and she will be joining that unit of Hunters, which has a Flint Napper, in the assistance of which she's got the Dreamcatcher artifact, which as a draw event, so she would have to choose between Dreamcatcher and her usual to the last breath heal. Dreamcatcher gives a regiment within 8 inches torrential fire. So, acting on the assumption that she will usually use both of her draw events on her unit, we have the first Fanatic of Conquest unit. Let's continue. We then have an Apex Predator, big, heavy, fast, scary, totally fine, cool. Scion of Conquest. We have Scion of Conquest with Essence of the Phenopteryx. Not a Warlord in this case, but that Essence of the Phenopteryx is the same technology that we saw in the previous Wardrune list, giving you, among other things, that really long counterspell bubble and focus just to make sure that you get your spells off. and then 2 Chosen of Conquest regiments with standard bearers. Chosen of Conquest always follow the Cult of Conquest and are Fanatic, which brings our Fanatic Conquest regiment count up to 3. We then have a Predator with Voice of Conquest, which makes his regiment count as belonging to the Cult of Conquest, and the Mantle of the Devoted and Marksmanship to personally increase his ranged ability. And he will be joining a unit of 4 Slingers with a Flint Snapper. Rounding his warband out, we then just have a small unit of Braves, a Hunting Pack, and an Apex Predator, which means that this is a list. Once again, this is a list with 3 scoring regiments, and these scoring regiments are not durable. These are a pair of Apex Predators and a Brave. Oh no, sorry, and I'm wrong. Of course, we have the Chosen of Conquest. So, sorry, there are a couple of War Rune lists that have this scoring count. This list has got five scoring regiments, including just Braves to be a disposable scoring unit. Never mind. Totally fine on scoring here. This is a list with 4 Fanatic of Conquest regiments. And what that means is that this list projects some threat. The Fanatic of Conquest, if you're not familiar with it, Fanatic of Conquest, the Tier 3 Conquest chant, Fanatic will enable you to reach Tier 3 with only 2 tokens, and gives you a bonus to your first march, so you get plus 3 inches on your first march move, and plus 2 evasion, which is a very big deal on some of these regiments, and it lets you perform a third action. Now, you are restricted to the usual action restrictions. You can't clash twice, for example. But just being able to perform 3 actions is enormously powerful. It opens up lines of play that otherwise wouldn't be possible, doing things like reforming, right? Just you can get pseudo-fluid formation, and it makes just all of the threat ranges massive because all of these regiments get a 9 or 8-inch march as their first action if they need to set everything up. That means that those Chosen of Conquest, for example, even though they are just movement 5 infantry, if they choose to march, charge, clash, they have a 13-inch plus rerollable d6 threat range, which significantly out-threats all cavalry, for example. Those range units can do things like move, shoot, move if they wanted to pull back, or they can move, shoot, move, aim, shoot. In the case of like the hunters, for example, where you can be getting torrential fire, you could use that to move into close range with torrential fire from the matriarch queen, and then aim, and then unleash a volley that is prodigious. You can even do things if you need to, right? In scenarios where objectives are on the line, you can do things like shoot, charge, clash. There are just a whole list of lines of play that make Fanatic of Conquest really intensely powerful. Being able to perform 3 actions is something that just most regiments can't do. It gives you it doesn't just give you like 50% more stuff that you can do, it opens up entire lines of play that otherwise wouldn't be possible. It represents both a tactical, like an unduplicatable tactical advantage. There's a reason why rules like fluid formation are really powerful, for example. It gives you an almost unduplicatable tactical advantage, and in many cases just numeric advantages, longer threat ranges, the ability to aim on shots that you otherwise wouldn't. Now, in terms of potential risks this list is taking, or vulnerabilities, I think it's absolutely worth noting that the list isn't durable. Hunters and slingers, if they get ranged in on it, right, they're not likely to, but if something manages to get the jump on them, if they get closed on in melee, if basically anything contacts them, they aren't durable. Apex predators aren't like, they're not weak, but they're not particularly tough either. 15 wounds is about the same as a minimum sized regiment. The Chosen of Conquest go pretty hard with 7 wounds per stand, but even then they're just defense 3. They can get up to evasion 3 as well, and they have very good resolve, but those minimum size units still only have 21 wounds. Like, nothing in this list will really survive, particularly if it gets an alpha strike against it. That means this list needs to set the tempo of engagements. It needs to hit really hard and fast enough to stop the counter-strike from being decisive. And in Conquest, that's hard to do because we play alternating activations. You don't get to just play your entire turn and then have your opponent play their entire turn. So there's an awful lot of skill expression possible in a list like this. If you understand and are able to take control of the tempo of the game, this list probably feels just an absolute blast to play. Like, damn. But I think probably the biggest threat it's going to face is that we are going to see over the course of these 16 lists some lists that really can accurately be described as gear checklists. There are a couple of people who have gone, I am going to take a list that is going to try and just mechanically win games off of some kind of raw strength. And for all of the speed and for all of the tactical flexibility and for all of the threat range extension that you get from a list like this, it may have to play into 12 stands of Ashen Dawn. Now, it's got some of the tools that it would need to deal with that. It's got some nice long-range pressure. It's got some high cleave. It's got, plenty-ish of cleave. But 12 stands of Ashen Dawn or 10 stands of Bone Golems is just an awful lot of meat. And so that's the kind of list that I would be interested, right? Like if the players, if Pavel, hopefully I pronounced that correctly, if Pavel has thought about that kind of a matchup, like how does this list go into just an Old Dominion brick shithouse style list where you have just the super tough Praetorian Guard regiments and the tons of bone golems, etc. Like how does it perform into that? How does it perform into the all cav for days, tons of wound, many Ashen Dawn? I'm really interested to see how, probably this is one of the lists that I'm most interested to see how it performs because the concept is awesome. I think there's a great deal of skill expression available in this list, and it would be really interesting to see if going this deep on this much Fanatic of Conquest actually does like break the game in some respect, if it does push past the usual boundaries and limitations and really enables the kind of maybe play styles and play options that we just otherwise wouldn't see. Super awesome list. Next up, and our third of 4 Woodrune players, we have Benjamin Lin, I believe from Singapore. Now, I'm not 100%, but I think this is Blitz Minis, which may be a name familiar to some people, and obviously playing Woodrune, and I think this is the first time in some time, and I'm therefore excited by, the Predator Warlord. Now, I mentioned, I think when we were talking about Pavel's list, that I was a bit concerned about scoring count. No, Pavel's list was fine. This is the second Woodrune list that is really, really light on scoring. So what have we got here? Well, firstly, we've got a Predator Warlord with Mantle of the Devoted and Voice of Conquest in a unit of 4 slingers. So that's the same tech as before. Animalistic Focus, if I didn't mention previously, does allow for extra actions as well. So you can do things with this list for this unit, for example, where you can move and shoot and move, which allows for some real fire and retreat style tactics if you want. And then here is where we see the first of several 4-strong stands of Raptor Riders. And in the context of those Raptor Riders is where we should sort of first discuss the Predator's Warlord ability, which is once per game that gives a few things that don't particularly matter, but importantly, gives +3 inches to your charge distances for light regiments. And this list has a lot of light melee regiments. So here we see the first of several 4-strong Raptor Riders regiments, which are chanting Famine. Now, while War is a pretty serviceable generalist, right, we saw some Raptor Riders, I think, that could chant War in a previous list, where as part of a more mixed warband, maybe War is nice. Famine, I think, comes into its own really well here. What does Famine give? Famine gives +2 inches of charge distance and shock just off of 2 markers. Both of those we can see, all right, we've just stacked +5 inches onto a speed 8 fluid formation regiment, which means that these things threat like further than those conquest dudes, those scions of conquest that we just those chosen of conquest that we just covered, right? This is extreme melee threat range because you use fluid formation to wang jangle the corner of your regiment closer on a 4-strong regiment that can comfortably add probably 5 or 6 inches of distance. Then we get +2 inches from shock. Then we get +3 inches from the predator. Then we get I think we have a huntress counts as a standard bearer. Yep, she does, so it's unstoppable, which means that we have just added something like +10 or 11 inches of threat onto an unstoppable speed 8 regiment, which means that you have basically 18 or 19-inch melee threat ranges. That's insane. That's insane. And if you've chanted Fanatic, so if you've chanted Famine, which you have to get +2, you've got Shock, so we're up to Clash 2. And if you have the tokens available, which not every one of these regiments will, but if you do have these tokens available, you're also going to get Relentless Blows from Famine. And Relentless Blows works very nicely with Flurry because you have multiple chances to roll those ones, right? We have Flurry, we reroll 5s and 6s in this particular case because we'll be hitting on 4s with a shock-inspired charge on Clash 2. Those 5 and 6s can reroll into 1s, which means you can score, you have no cleave, right? You don't have any cleave, but with this many Raptor Riders, you just put out an absolutely ungodly number of attacks from downtown. So, having established that a 4-strong unit of Raptor Riders can do that, let's see what else we have in this list. We have a Matriarch Queen. Absolute nothing special going on for her. She's just 100 points, and she'll be sitting in that unit of 3 Blooded. The Blooded have a Skirmisher, which gives the regiment +1 march. Now, normally it would be pretty common to see trackers on skirmishes instead, because flank is a good rule, but that's the only medium in this entire list, so it doesn't need flank. It'll be turning up automatically on turn 2 just fine. +1 march in this case gives it just a little bit more reach in terms of getting where it needs to go, and I'm pretty sure that the job of this regiment is basically just to get onto a zone and hold that zone while fighting is happening 20 inches in the distance closer towards your opponent's deployment zone, and then occasionally have the blooded move around and just use the matriarchs to the last breath ability on something that needs healing. I don't think this regiment wants to fight, and it's not particularly good at fighting. It's defense 2. It can probably hold its own against some sort of a small MSU regiment, but really this is just one of 3 regiments in the entire army that can score. Its job is going to be to score. We then have a mounted predator, unit of 4 Raptor Riders, and then another unit of 4 Raptor Riders, and then a unit of 3 Raptor Riders. Now, I can't be sure where the Predator is going to go. I personally would like to think that he's going to go in that 3 unit of Raptor Riders, so that we have a nice symmetric 4 units of 4, but it's very possible that Benjamin will put him in one of the units of 4 Raptor Riders to go up to 5, etc. I'm just choosing to imagine in this case that we're going for the pleasing visual symmetry of 4 strong units, and then an Apex Predator. Now, this gives us a list of extremes. It has some extreme high points and some good lord extreme risks that it is running. We'll start with the high points. Holy damn those Raptor Riders. They are very fast. They will be getting up the field. I strongly suspect, like, this list has options for technical play. Raptor Riders are extremely quick and have fluid formation, which means that they can turn on a dime and get where they need to go and do other things. If they need to retreat from a situation, pull back, fight somewhere else, they can motor across the table, no problem at all. What I suspect a lot of Ben's list, at least in practice, what his games have turned out to be, is a fight that basically happens on his opponent's deployment zone line. There are games against slower deploying armies where you are literally jumping their models as they arrive on turn 2 before they have a chance to do everything, and the entire fight is taking place with you charging them within march distance of their table edge. And you make those attacks, you just have those fights, you churn through there, you use the alpha strike advantage that you have landing all of those attacks, just really chunking into chewing up whatever it is that your opponent trickles onto the board. And although you might eventually get overwhelmed as really powerful heavies begin to arrive, you've spent so long on zones by then that your 2 apex predators and your blooded get to just fight sort of whatever is left. And like, thumbs up, cool, big aggressive energy, and you can, if the game demands it, pivot and just not do that. You have the huge maneuverability of the Raptor Riders, which enables a great deal of tactical flexibility if you need to push force somewhere else. That's super cool. The downside of this list is that if you take 45 wounds, which is not that many wounds over the course of a game of Conquest, 45 wounds in the wrong place at the wrong time annihilates 100% of this list's scoring ability. That's terrifying. Like, I definitely suspect that most of the time the metaphorical line of scrimmage will be set so far from some zones that it's not a concern that you have this little unit of blooded or an apex predator sitting alone on a zone scoring you points. But if you do run into a list that comes even remotely close to equaling your threat range, or can punish you at range, or can stop you from diving on it, for example, all of those things can add up to just casualties that rob you of the ability to score. It's also worth noting that obviously 4 strong units, 4 is an awkward unit size for break and shatter math. Now, Raptor Riders have 5 wounds, evasion 2, and resolve 3. Not terrible defensive stats, but it's not too difficult to do 15 wounds to a unit with evasion 2, resolve 3, and 15 wounds in one turn will shatter those regiments, which means you can be very susceptible to units just being picked up off the table if you get hit by a sufficiently strong kind of attack. You could also be at risk if you run into like really high defense. So something like defense for Blessed, like, sure, absolutely, you can just put a ton of hits into them with Raptor Riders, but if they're defense for Blessed, they're taking 1 in 9 of those hits is translating to a wound. And the Raptor Riders might do like 20 hits. You could actually reasonably do 20 hits to an enemy regiment with a unit of 4 Raptor Riders with all of the famine buffs, which is 2 wounds to a unit of Ashen Dawn. Maybe 3 if you're lucky. And so, again, not to harp back to some of the gear check lists that we will see, for example, when we get to 100 Kingdoms, but that is one of the weaknesses of a list like this, where it needs to absolutely concentrate force into jump on and destroy that kind of opposing list. And although I think it could probably surround and isolate some weaker units really quite capably, anything that just turns up, like a really big unit of hoplites that turns up, for example, if you aren't in a position where you can hit the flanks hard, you might struggle to just do anything to it. If it turns up with its flanks protected, do you just hit it in the front where it's defense 4 rerolling 6s, for example? Like, that's a challenge. So this is yet another list out of Wardrone, along with the all activations all the time, Fnatic Conquest list. I would love to hear how games against this go. I suspect it's going to play to the extremes, but I do think any list that is this fast and has this kind of threat range and this much mobility has some strong skill expression as well. So super keen. This is on my list of Wardrune lists that I am super keen to hear how it goes. I think it's really interesting. I think it is taking a terrible risk with so little weight in scoring, but that risk, if it pays off, really could just chew up some opposing lists and spit them out. Now, our fourth and final Wardrune list, also from Poland, belongs to Alexander. I think Alexander Novak is how you would pronounce that. And we have probably the most kind of well-rounded, just generally solid, that is combining a lot of the same kind of ideas that we saw in previous lists, in particular the many Fnatic Conquest list, in a bit more restrained and melee-focused mode this time. So this time around we have a Chieftain Warlord, which will give shock to all of his regiments, which means that when they use those really long threat ranges to get charges, Chosen of Conquest, for example, are going to Native Clash 4, Inspired, so will be 4s rerolling 6s rather than just hitting on 4s, which is a nice bonus to their offense. Shock also obviously helps Chosen of Conquest because they have a few impact attacks. Just a generally solid and well-rounded kind of setup. And then we have Mantle of the Devoted and Voice of Conquest once again for that Fnatic of Conquest effect. This time, being on a Chieftain, we have the Chieftain's own significant melee abilities. He's got Flurry, he's got 6 attacks with Cleave 2, he hits super hard. He's going to be giving this big regiment of Blooded that he is joining Flurry as well through Violence of Action, and then Wasteland Adder is going to give them Flank, meaning that they're going to be on the board quite aggressively along with at least one of these two other chosen regiments. So with this Blooded regiment, we have 6 of them. This is a big, heavy regiment. They've got a champion for a large number of attacks, and Mantle of the Devoted Voice of Conquest means that, much like the Chosen of Conquest, they will be really aggressively charging, able to move 8, march, and then charge 5 plus rerollable d6 into combat where they will just do an absolute ton of damage. Particularly of note with the Blooded as well is they also benefit significantly from the second tier of the Conquest chant, which gives +2 to evasion. The big weakness of Blooded, although they are just very solid offensively, right, with the champion we're up to 7 attacks from 6, and plenty of wounds and decent enough resolve with the chieftain, defense 2 evasion 1 kind of sucks. Going up to evasion 3 all of a sudden makes a unit of that size surprisingly difficult to chew through on the backswing, which is a really significant deal and makes them an obvious first choice to go in just off the first card, well, the second card of the stack. You'll chain Chieftain into them to always have enough chant markers to chant Fnatic of Conquest, and then just pull the trigger and go. We then have, much as we saw before, Essence of the Phenopteryx and Focused Scion of Conquest, good, well-rounded utility caster, very, very long range on his spells, including his Dispel Bubble, and 2 units of Chosen of Conquest, 1 of 4 and 1 of 3. The Scion could go in either. I would be very lightly inclined to put him in the 4-strong regiment. It will see that he lives a little bit longer if he needs to. It avoids awkward sizes. Chosen of Conquest, doing 21 wounds for Chosen of Conquest regiment is doable, but it's not easy. But it would just mean that you have 5 and 3, which is a little bit better from the break and shadow math perspective. But more importantly, it gives you 2 really strong regiments to auto onto the table on turn 2. You flank on the Chieftain's regiment, you auto on the Chosen of Conquest with the Scion, and there you go. You've got a ton of force pushing forward aggressively up the table really quickly. We then have a Predator. Sacred Censer is a nice artifact to see. Now, obviously not essential. It just gives Priest 1, which allows for interference as a bubble. You don't need that as much when you have the Scion of Conquest, but it's also, from memory, a 5-point artifact, and that gets you to 2,000 points, and it might come up some of the time, well worth the 5 points. He's got Marksmanship, and in his Warband we have a Hunting Pack, and then a unit of 4 hunters and a unit of 4 slingers. These are big regiments. Like going up to 5 when the Predator joins one of those two, I would assume, but I wouldn't guarantee, but I would assume the slingers. Five wide range regiments can just start to get a little bit awkward as fast units approach them at oblique angles. It can be difficult to bring all of your firepower to bear because of the distance between the enemy as they're approaching at like a 45-degree angle to you and the furthest away units stands in the regiment. But these are still quite dangerous and scary. There's almost an argument for putting him in the hunters and being able to use them as a mixed ranged melee kind of regiment. You can, in a pinch, absolutely use hunters in melee. They got 5 attacks, they got clash 2, he can fight a little bit, but more traditionally he would be in slingers, and then an apex predator. Now, this is once again a 10 activation, so quite elite Wardrune list. It's not much like before, it's not hugely durable, but the extra Hand of Chosen of Conquest and the thickness, the pleasing thickness of that Blooded regiment does give me, particularly once you start taking Evasion +2 into consideration with those Blooded, this list feels like it can maybe very slightly go the distance. Obviously, and obviously it's more dangerous in melee thanks to the chieftain, like on the charge, it hits a little bit harder. Obviously, compared to the other list we saw, which I think might also have been from a Polish player, which had 4 Fanatic of Conquest regiments, this has 3. Also, importantly, it doesn't have any Fanatic of Conquest on its ranged options. It's really all in on the melee. It's pushing the melee Fanatic of Conquest Blooded, melee Fanatic of Conquest Chosen, and Chosen again. Now, although the scoring situation for this list isn't quite as dire, for example, as Benjamin's list, this list does only have four stands that can score, which means that if 4 regiments that can score, rather, which means that a lot of the time you are going to have a situation where one of these expensive regiments, like the Apex Predator, is the cheapest scoring regiment that you have. Apex Predators are dangerous, fast, useful, restricted, powerful-ish monsters. Like they're very solid. They're good to use. They're not like a Tontor where a Wrecking Ball, and they're obviously much cheaper. 190 points for an Apex Predator is affordable, but 190 points for a regiment being forced to sit on an objective compared to 120 points for a unit of Blooded, for example, is a sacrifice that the list is making in order to accomplish all of its other goals. Now, I think with 4 scoring regiments, this list is less exposed, but on the other hand, a lot of those regiments are dangerous melee regiments that will have to be thrown into the fray. Now, what I do think would be very interesting is a game between, for example, this list and something like Blitz's list, which is trying to go over the top of it in terms of threat range and damage output. I think that would be hugely fascinating. Because while this list, for example, might be a little bit better suited to concentrating force and engaging things like gear check kind of lists, and it's got some good range, etc. as well. It's sort of relatively well-rounded in that respect. I wonder how it goes when it's literally being pinned back to its own deployment zone by 16 stands of Raptors that are closing with it and have threat ranges that are incredibly long. It would genuinely be very interesting to see where the line is between those two lists. Like who is presenting more aggression, who is the beatdown, how does that matchup play? And if anyone who is at Chios or watching Chios, if this matchup occurs, super interested to hear how it goes, because I genuinely don't know how that plays out. That match of 2 different highly potentially aggressive styles, but also 2 different really potentially flexible styles. On one hand, you have in Benjamin's list all of the mobility of the like fluid formation and the extreme speed, and then you just have the activation count from Alexander's list. In any case, I think Alexander's list probably the most well-rounded generally. Good mix of range, good mix of melee, good mix of Fanatic of Conquest, at least 4 scoring regiments. Probably the list that is running the fewest significant risks, but in exchange it's reaching maybe slightly less significant highs, but I think it's more sensible and conservative, although still, by my standards of a Wardrune list, very much out there. Alright, Christ, we are only a quarter of a way there. Okay. Moving on to Spires. Carl Swanson from the United States. I think the only Spires list at the event, and one of probably 2, I imagine 2 players from the United States. No, I'm completely wrong. There are like 5 players from the United States. Awesome, go USA. So one of 5 players, but I think multiple regions potentially in the USA. Either way, representing Region D. Yeah, so they're Region B and Region D from the United States. So one of 3 players representing region D, we got there in the end, and the only Spires player we have Carl Swanson. Now, Carl's list is a list that leaps out to me as being really, really well refined. This is a list that I suspect has gone through quite a number of incarnations, and there are some markers of that that you can kind of see in the list in terms of character upgrades and how they're allocated and how the list is broadly structured. And I'll call out a few of those as we go through before giving some thoughts at the end. So we're starting with a Biomancer Warlord. That makes this a directorate list, which gives it access to 2 notable things. Firstly, it gives it access to the subdermal keratin induction biomancy, which turns a light unit into a medium unit and will enable, for example, Strix, who are a speed 10 light regiment, to score. The other thing it does is gives the army-wide access to the Burnout draw event, only once per round, but you can have 1 regiment benefit from Burnout. Now, Burnout obviously is a 2-edged sword. Yes, you get a bonus to speed and a bonus to clash, but you also take on average 1 wound per stand in the regiment, which is pretty significant. Often, Burnout is a negative expected value kind of rule, but it enables you to make plays you otherwise wouldn't. And there are a couple of regiments in this list that are kind of telegraphed as this is a pretty solid regiment to be able to use Burnout on if you need to. But Biomancer Warlord, so the Biomancer's supremacy ability, proximity sensors, will enable the Biomancer to target friendly regiments anywhere on the table if they're in range of an objective zone. Mostly, not exclusively, most of that is used with subdermal keratin induction, but there are some other biomancies as well that can really benefit from that. For example, because of Master of Flesh, this Biomancer can do 2 Biomancies and 2 Mend Fleshes per turn. There are multiple Biomancies that allow you to activate a regiment immediately. Now, one of them, Essence Transfer, has an effectively unlimited range, provided you are within 12 inches of the unit you are transferring Essence from. You just pull a card from the bottom of your stack up to that point, and then that regiment, regardless of distance, activates, provided the regiment that's within 12 that you've moved to the bottom of the stack, Spires are complicated, was within 12. You've got effectively unlimited range there. But then if you want to use Adrenal Surge, which is the second Biomancy that can enable a unit to activate immediately after the Biomancer, that requires range. It's within range 12, or infinite range if you're targeting a regiment in range of an objective zone. So if you have, say, 2 regiments, and one of them is touching an objective zone and one of them's not, say a unit of Centaur, Avatara, and Prideborn, if you want to absolutely front load your turn, you can do that by combining proximity sensors with Master of Flesh with these 2 biomancies, provided you can get your stack order exactly correctly. That gives you the option to pull that kind of trigger. Now, if I had to guess, I'd say that is strictly a sometimes play. I don't think Carl is going to be pulling that trigger frequently, because this is a really wide list. This list has 13 activations, which is the second highest in the entire event, and is a full 3 activations over some of the Wood-Ruin lists that we've seen, for example. And that tells me this list, most of the time, is playing more of a control game. We also have some good ranged units, including long-range units. We have a high ranged unit count. I think this list has the most ranged regiments of any that we have seen, if you don't count Raptor Riders as a ranged unit, because they're not. So I suspect most of the time, this list is playing more of a control game. It's letting its opponent play out their activations, then it's pouncing a bit later in the turn. But if it needs to pull the trigger, it absolutely can, which is really cool. Now, there are 2 other kind of markers in terms of this Biomancer that tell me that this is a really refined list. The first is 6 stands of Force-Grown Drones. Now, my golden rule for Force-Grown Drone regiments is that they should be exactly as large as they need to be to survive whatever attacks that are being levied against them, and no larger. It can be very tempting to build very, 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 very big Force-Grown Drone regiments, to keep adding stands to them. You want your Force-Grown Drones to be as small as you possibly can, that they need to be, but to still be able to survive the attacks that are coming against them. And 6 stands of Force-Grown Drones tells me that this is a regiment that can't probably be made any smaller, but is just large enough. With the Biomancer in them, it will go up to 7 stands, and dealing 12 wounds to a regiment of Force-Grown Drones is not easy. It's not too difficult, but it's just difficult enough that if the Force-Grown Drones then activate, you have the activation advantage that this list offers. The Force-Grown Drones can activate, they can rally themselves, the Biomancer can then Mend Flesh, Biotic Renewal, get like maybe 2 stands, 1 stand back. But in short, 6 is a very considered size for this regiment. There would have been a temptation, I suspect, during testing to have it be larger and drawn back down to this level to afford important upgrades elsewhere. The other thing that's really interesting here is the presence of degenerative aura rather than cascading degeneration. Now, there is a 5-point upgrade on the High Clone Executor we'll see in a second that could very easily, it's almost vestigial, it could very easily be cut to turn degenerative aura, which gives lethal demise, into cascading degeneration, which gives Aura of Death 4. Now, Aura of Death 4 Force-Grown Drones are a very meta pick. Aura of Death 4 on a wide regiment is very dangerous. But Degenerative Aura, I think, here is the sensible and more considered option. Couple of reasons why. Firstly, the Biomancer is very, very important. You don't want him to die, and having an ability on the regiment that kind of says do not touch is very useful. It disincentivizes the enemy jumping on you and engaging you, whereas Aura of Death is actually a regiment that incentivizes your opponent to act quickly and aggressively against you, because they need to attack you before you can activate and engage them, lest they take Aura of Death when they activate. Secondly, this list is a 13 activation list, which means that it is often not going to be having its choice of whether to go first or not, which means that being able to jump your opponents and inflict Aura of Death is just not necessarily going to be as viable a tactic. It would be risky in any case on a unit of just 6. And finally, this list has a lot of range units, including some very dangerous but only moderate range ones like Leonine Avatara, which need space created for them. Leonine need to be able to get in range to deal damage. Range 14 is good, but it's just good. It's not like range 20, range 18, etc. And so they benefit hugely from having just some space created in which they can operate. And unlike Aura of Death, which requires you to basically get into melee with your opponents, Lethal Demise is very good for having the regiment just sort of exist in a spot that creates space. And so, even though it would be very easy for Degenerative Aura to have been cascading degeneration here, I think Degenerative Aura is showcasing, subtly, a really, really mature and practiced list, which tells me I think Carl's going to do pretty well. Anyway, after that, we've got, moving on to our second of 4 warbands, we have a range setup High Clone Executor. He's got Biotic Hive, Marksman variant, and Ablative Flesh. Ablative Flesh is that one that could easily have been dispensed with if needed, but it's very, very cheap, and he had the points. And he will be giving Overtax Nervous System, which gives double time, and then Disperse, which gives loose formation, to that unit of Marksman Clone. So that Marksman Clone will be not too vulnerable. Obviously, they are still just defense 1, but loose formation, so a little bit tricky to pin down with counter battery fire, very long range, arcing fire, tons of shots. The High Clone himself is contributing a great deal of damage out of that regiment. And then a unit of Vanguard Clones. Vanguard Clones, although this list obviously has subdermal keratin induction, and so it can score very aggressively if it needs to, Vanguard Clones are still a good, flexible scoring regiment, and with a high number of attacks but only a medium clash of 2, are quite strong beneficiaries of burnout if that's a trigger that you need to pull. You can, in a pinch, also juice them up with things like the Biomancer's various bonuses, so you could give them Deadly Blades and their own burnout plus 1 clash. That's an option as well. They can be fired off as a missile, or they can just sit in a zone and score it. Just a solid, well-rounded, 150 points is a little premium, but a good regiment. We then have the Lineage Prideborn. No upgrades, she's perfectly fine by herself. 3 Leonine Avatara. 3 more Leonine Avatara, and then a unit of Centaur Avatara. Obviously, there is that synergy between these, where if the Leonine Avatara shoot a target, the Centaur Avatara gain a bonus to their impact attacks. In practice, with the kind of lists that I play, I have found that to be extremely unreliable. Just not something that can be pulled off with any kind of regularity, because where I need troops and where I need where I need the Centaur versus where I need the Leonine is not always necessarily the same. It's a nice to have, but I have found that pushing it is a little bit dangerous. In this particular case, because you have the ability to chain activate if you want to with the Biomancer, and the Leonine and Centaurs are both solid beneficiaries of the bonus to clash/volley, you might see some plays where you really do pull that trigger and the Biomancer goes whoop, 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 and the Leonine shoot, and then the Centaur immediately activate and charge. Maybe they march charge, maybe they charge clash to a ton of damage. Again, I suspect with 13 activations, this list is generally going to be playing slightly more of a control style. That's just an option, a trigger that can be pulled. Leonine Avatara are excellent on their own merits, Centaur Avatara are pretty excellent on their own merits, and good beneficiaries of some of the force multipliers in this list. Finally, our fourth warband, we have a Ferromancer with just avatar projection in a minimum size unit of brute drones and 2 regiments of Strix. With 2 regiments of Strix, we have 3 light regiments, which gives us a very good chance, right? Like an 8 in 9 chance of having 2 light regiments turn up on the first turn, which will be usually at least depending on the scenario, a unit of Strix and probably the Biomancer's regiment, which means, for example, this list has an 8 in 9 chance of being able to score points on turn 1 in Maelstrom if it is so inclined. And given that those are free points, against most armies in the game, it's very likely to do so. It's also worth noting that there are, with both a Biomancer and a Ferromancer, there are a lot of potentials for force multiplication in this list, which is a little bit easier to do when you have the activation advantage. 13 activations will give you usually a significant, like a 2 or 3 activation advantage over quite a lot of the lists that'll be at Chios. And the high watermark for potential is, for example, you can give bonuses to Clash and Deadly Blades to Centaur Avatara, and debuff the defense of an enemy regiment using Induce Lethargy from the Ferromancer, which is better than Cleave because it doesn't really bypass is hardened. You get a ton of damage out of a small regiment there. So there's a great deal of moving parts in the manner of the best Spires lists. Now, if I wanted to leverage a critique at this is a list I would say is quite hard to critique because it's obviously very, very carefully considered. I think probably the closest thing I would have to a regret about this list, if I had written it myself, is that it kind of is forced into running 4 characters. And in particular, the Lineage Highborn and the High Clone Executor is a bit of a challenge to have both present in the same list. And that just comes back to the very simple reality that characters in Conquest, although they add activations, they don't in practice actually add any wounds. They add no robustness to a list. They might add their resolve stat. Yes, the High Clone does add the loose formation to his unit of marksmen, but basically in general, characters that are just combat characters are often one of the larger taxes you have to play in the game. Now, Ferromancer and Biomancer, although that's a very expensive Biomancer, over the course of the game it will probably mint back quite a lot of its value. In healing regiments, it can do 2 healing actions and a healing draw event every turn. It doesn't take too long, especially if the Ferromancer is doing healing a little bit using the accelerated hibernation. These are characters that can kind of pay for themselves in addition to providing force multiplication. It is much harder for a unit or a character like the Lineage Prideborn, for example, to pay for herself over the course of the game. The Lineage Prideborn is 120 points, and it's going to be pretty rare that even with plenty of turns of uninterrupted shooting, she gets to deal 120 points worth of damage to the enemy. And when you consider that she effectively adds 0 wounds to the regiment that she's joining, this means that she's a little bit of a tax just to unlock her warband. And the High Clone Executor, clocking in at an impressive 160 points, is kind of the same. Like, if the High Clone Executor just didn't need to be taken, obviously this is a pipe dream, but bear with me. If the High Clone Executor just didn't need to exist, and we could spend all of those points on just a whole nother unit of marksman clones, that would be stronger than just having the High Clone Executor. Like, yes, he just about doubles the durability of the unit that he's in, but you would get literally double the durability by having a whole second regiment, in addition to considerably more. Like, he's dangerous, but he's not 16 shots dangerous. And so that's kind of like a case study. Like, these obviously, you can't build an army that way. You have to take characters, the characters have to unlock warbands, and this is just me. This is me searching for anything to criticize at all about this list. To be very, very clear here, I think this list is excellent and very well crafted. If it were possible in Spires to cut just one of those combat characters and still have a list that is as diverse and doing as many things, that would be the only thing I can think of that is a material improvement here. Obviously, that's not possible, but that, kind of the fact that you are putting 120 to 160 points into characters that don't really add that same amount of durability or damage, that's the closest thing the list has to an inefficiency. That's literally it. That's all I've got. This is a list that I expect to do well. This is a list that really showcases a great amount of practice. It can play all parts of the game. The ranged output is prodigious, and it has the second highest activation count and is very well set up to take advantage of that activation count. There is a single list with more activations than this, and everything otherwise it outstrips everything. There is nothing that equals this in the entire setup as far as I'm aware. There's one list with 14, this is the only list with 13, and then everything else this will have an activation count advantage over. Now, I wish I could say that was a smooth segue because I am now going into the list that has 14 activations. I had forgotten the order that these were in when I ordered these. So, hey, let's just pretend that that was a real thing. And I meant to do that really, really smart segue as we look at the Sorcerer Kings list with 14 activations. Now, this is a regiment, so this is an army that I'm actually not going to be able to speak about at any great length. And that is not because I'm unfamiliar with it, but rather because I'm very familiar with it. I helped Ewan write this, I've played many practice games against it, and I can talk in great detail about how it plays, which means that my insight into this list isn't speculative. I know it, I helped refine it, I helped playtest against it, I've had my face ground into dust by it multiple times. As such, it would not really be fair on Ewan for me to talk at great length about how it plays. It's an awesome list. I look forward to seeing how he goes. We will talk through it now. We'll talk through what's in it, and I will make some very high-level observations, but otherwise, we'll just have to see how Ewan does. So what is Ewan playing? So this is a Sorcerer Kings list, and it is a wide Sorcerer Kings list. This is the only list in the entire event that reaches 14 activations. It's the only list that outstrips Carl's 13 activation Spires list. So we have a Maharaja Court of Air Warlord. Maharaja Warlord is pretty much obligatory in Sorcerer Kings right now. The rework of rituals sort of immediately after their release left them in a state where rituals are still very good and very powerful, but you have to be able to complete them, which means you need the characters, you need the ritual tokens, etc. Maharaja just accounts for that. Shulat is the artifact that enables him any rituals he starts with more tokens, so we can see that theme again. Lots of ritual generation. Court of Air, there are two Maharajas in this list, and you cannot have Maharajas of the same court. Court of Air and Court of Fire. Court of Air of the two, and we'll see this when we get to the next Sorcerer Kings list, I think is probably the more powerful, if only because homing winds as a range spell is frankly egregious. It's like Sorcerer Kings have a great deal of utility in their spellcasting. They tend not to have the sort of high watermark of damage that like Dweghom with their Mastery of Fire and that sort of elemental offense has. They have the versatility instead. The Homing Winds is one of the few spells that they have that is not just versatile, it's completely cracked. Full ranged rerolls is not just a strictly better version of a spell that exists elsewhere in the game. Poor Air Mage from the Hundred Kingdoms is just looking on being like, well, I let people reroll sixes. What's going on with that? But it plays into the way that Sorcerer Kings plays just extremely well with a whole bunch of range. He'll be sitting in a unit of 3 Dunhood Disciples, a good ranged unit. Then we have a Sorcerer, Court of Fire. The Sorcerer has no special rules, just coming in at 100 points, good utility spells, she's a good spellcaster. We then have 3 Flamecasters, 3 Flamecasters, 3 Flamecasters, and 3 Downhill Disciples. We're starting to see here how the activation count adds up. These are all minimum size units. We then have the Court of Fire. Again, we can't have Court of Air and can't have 2 Court of Air Maharajas. We have a Court of Fire one here. Court of Fire Maharaja has probably the best offensive spells in Sorcerer Kings. If you're doing Conflagration and generating spells with that, then you get the most hits out of his offensive spell, and he'll be sitting in a unit of 3 Regicur. The rest of his warband is 3 Sword Dancers, 3 Sword Dancers, and 3 Sword Dancers. So, for those keeping count at home, we have 6 Brute regiments. 3 of them are Flamecasters, 3 of them are Sword Dancers. We then have another Fire Sorceress. This time we have one of the second artifact in the list. She has Jadu Kavach. What that means is that if she successfully casts a spell, then all Born of Fire regiments will be able to reroll 6s, and all of the brutes in the list, all of the elementals, most of the list, effectively with the sole exception of the Maharaja's Dano Disciple regiment, is Born of Fire, which means we get a great deal of synergy. I think this is a 30-point artifact. If she just casts a spell, reroll 6s on basically the entire army. She's in a 3-stand of Regicur, which means we also have nice pleasing synergy, 2 regiments of Regicur, 2 Danho Disciples. So this is 14 activations, 4 characters, 10 regiments, everything are MSUs, and the list is 100% medium, which means nothing arrives early, nothing necessarily arrives particularly late, none of the heavies are present, right? We don't see an elephant, for example, no Rakshasa. which means that all of the damage has to be done by those brute regiments, by the range, by the melee, etc. Good combined arms, just tons of activations, tons of support spell casting. No single regiment that is a hero, but a great deal of width. Tons of activations, tons of units, lots and lots of hits without any particular, like there's no cleave and no armor piercing in the list, but the sorcerers can give -1 defense to enemy regiments, and otherwise take full advantage of the Sorcerer Kings' unique faction mechanics and what we kind of felt were, at the moment, their strongest regiment choices. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning of going through this list, that's really about all I can, in fairness, say, because if we get into anything more about this, we would really be talking about this, like the genuine, like the practiced tactical execution that I have seen this list play through, which wouldn't be particularly fair on Ewan because I don't have the same insight into everyone else. So instead, I will just wish Ewan well, and all of the best at Chios. Now, moving on to our second Sorcerer Kings list, which I have no special insight into, I can therefore pontificate about on length, we have Christopher Lobodozinski. I hope I got that approximately correct. Our sole player from Region H, the UK. Now, in comparison to Ewan, Chris is running a much higher and tighter, larger blocks of regiments kind of Sorcerer Kings list. Sorcerer Kings obviously have access to the ritual mechanic, which generates cards that go into their deck, which then have small effects, and synergy with elemental units. Rituals can chain into the Born of Air or Fire style regiments, but regardless of whether or not you do that, if an elemental activates immediately after you've performed a ritual, immediately in the sense of them being your next activation, they can perform 3 actions. Now, in Ewan's list, it can absolutely do that. All it has are 3 strong regiments, so Ewan needs to be making the maximum that he can out of those triple activation effects on smaller regiments. In this case, we have some big regiments, which means that we are looking to make big plays with the elemental synergy. So, we've got, just to start with, we have a Sorcerer, Court of Air, in Danho Disciples. The Court of Air Sorcerer is notable for being, I would say, probably slightly more technical, but she's interesting in that she has some synergy with the Court of Fire if you have Court of Fire elsewhere. So, for example, we can see that those goals are Born of Flame. The Sorcerer of Air has an offensive spell, which if she hits the enemy, and it is engaged with a Court of Fire regiment, a Born of Flame regiment, she turns off their scoring for a round. Now, it's not necessarily going to be easy for this list to leverage that, but we have seen, for example, some Wardrune lists that have very, very few scoring regiments. Sorcerer Kings actually have a little bit of ability between Intrusive Thoughts and a Ritual and the Sorcerer of Air, not present in Ewan's list, but present here, to turn off scoring. And in those lists that have very low scoring regiment counts, that can be really punishing. We then have a unit of 4 Steelheart Djinn, so 4 Danho Disciples, which she'll join, 3 goals, 4 Steelheart Djinn. We then have, unsurprisingly, a Court of Air Maharaja Warlord with Shulat, so that's doing the heavy lifting for our ritual play, and Neantron, which makes him a more powerful wizard able to ignore some scaling. Now, what that says to me, apart from I probably had some points spare, is that he really, really wants to be able to make sure that he's granting rerolls even to the larger regiments in this list. Maharaja at Wizard 7 normally are quite good spellcasters, but it is possible to fail to successfully cast your Homing Wind spell on a 5-strong regiment. You need 3 successes there. Why not just guarantee it? Because Homing Winds is just so powerful on like a big unit of Danho Disciples, for example, that it's just not worth dealing with the chance of failure. Hence, we take Neantron. We've then got the Maharaja himself is in for Danho Disciples, so this is the second unit of 4. Then we have the third warband in the list, starting with an eye-wateringly expensive sorcerer. Now, she is, in this instance, she is a brute. She has Eye of the Blazing Tempest, which heals everything within a radius of her whenever she does the free elemental rituals activation action, which will be every turn. And she is packing just an absolute ton of brutes in her warband. 2 minimum-sized regiments of sword dancers, 1 outsized big 5-strong regiment of sword dancers, and I suspect she will be joining that unit of 4 Efreet flamecasters. So we have big regiments here, lots and lots of fire brutes, lots and lots of range, and lots of melee, which are set up to be able to take advantage of force multiplication. Court of Fire Sorceress, in addition to being able to do things like make the goals scoring, she has the -1 defense spell, and with Elemental Projection, she can cast it with quite long range, which is particularly useful for taking advantage of, for example, the Conflagration Ritual, which just gives you a free spellcast. And so, in very sharp comparison to Ewan's list, for example, where Yes, there is ritual synergy, but it's really focused on much smaller regiments. Here we have big regiments. We have probably a effectively five strong unit of flamecasters, a five strong unit of sword dancers that are kind of telegraphed as being probably the recipients of our triple activation. Now, while I have to congratulate Chris with being able to write a 2,000 point Sorcerer Kings list, which is bloody harder than you would think it would be, they are so thin on the ground in terms of cheap, like, filler upgrades because their standard bearers are all free. They have some very expensive upgrades, like 40 points. It costs 40 points to make that Sorcerer a Brute, and a lot of Sorcerer Kings upgrades are like 20 or 30 points. There's almost nothing. In fact, there might be nothing that is filler. So congratulations to Chris for being able to actually write a 2,000 point on the nose, use all of your resources list. I think there are some things that we can kind of pick apart here. And the first of those, just kind of generally, is Sorcerer Kings as they are, whether you like it or not, push you a little bit towards activation count. Because rituals count as cards in your command stack, although this is a 13 activation list, it's often in practice going, sorry, if this is an 11 activation list, it's often in practice going to be 12. And 12 activations is nice. That's a lovely number if you're building to play to it. But you have a lot of your power focused in very large regiments, which you are not going to be able to guarantee first action with. You aren't spreading out enough to be able to sort of have a play no matter what's going on. You're telegraphing pretty significantly play out of certain regiments. So I think 11 activations as Sorcerer Kings is almost kind of the anti-sweet spot where your opponents will almost always have the advantage on the command of the supremacy roll, but you don't have enough depth in your command stack to be able to play the late part of the turn in a way that makes up for it. I'm also a bit concerned, particularly with that decision to run exactly 4 Steelheart Djinn. Now, points are points. It's just how things, I imagine it's just how things played out. But for Steelheart Djinn are not particularly durable. Like, yes, they have 5 wounds, but defense 3, resolve 3 relative to the points that they cost. That regiment is Shatterbait. It is not tremendously difficult to deal 15 wounds to a regiment of that durability, and in this instance, dealing 15 wounds to those Steelheart Djinn in a turn is going to knock 260 points out of your list's offensive capability. I'm also personally very skeptical of ever paying 40 points to make a sorcerer into a brute. Being a brute is nice, being able to join that regiment is nice, but it's just nice. And 40 points does not cut it for just nice, particularly given that you can absolutely trim and find some points elsewhere and just give her a unit of Danho Disciples to sit in. It would not take many sacrifices to cut one stand from each of the other 2 Danho Disciple lists, make them a little bit more nimble, cut Neantran, cut the Brute upgrade from her, and I think at that point you have come very close to just paying for a unit of Danho Disciples for her to go in. In fact, I think if you cut Neantran, you've got it exactly. You keep everything else as it is. You have one more stand of Danho Disciples than you did previously. Yes, you're spreading your buffs a little bit thinner. It's harder to get homing wins on as large a regiment, but you have a whole extra range unit. You are not paying that colossal points premium to put her in a brute regiment. Bound to the elements, to me, telegraphs, like, I think it is probably never the correct choice, as expensive as it is. 40 points is eye-watering, and I like the idea of the regiments that she's going in. I like the idea of the power projection coming out of those regiments, but that is kind of a frivolous expenditure of points that did not need to be spent. And this person owns 8 Danho Disciples. You can't tell me that they don't own a 9th stand somewhere that would enable them to field 3 minimum-sized regiments rather than 2 outsized ones, given how easy it would be to make that swap. Now, setting that critique aside, this list has many of the strengths of Sorcerer Kings. It has triple activations very nearly on demand once you have your rituals flowing. It has a very solid ranged mix, almost a Spires-esque mix of nice long range and also more dangerous shorter range. It has spellcasting, force multiplication. It has a lot going on. I think this list is extremely serviceable. I think it will perform completely adequately, but I think there are these little inefficiencies, these little choices in it that add up overall that make me a bit less optimistic for it than I might be for some other lists at this event. All right, up next and getting into the Old Dominion, one of 2 Old Dominion players, Stephen Murasan, I believe from the United States. We have Old Dominion with what I really have to describe as kind of a 4-regiment special. This is a relatively simple list that is trying to project a great deal of power through a relatively limited number of regiments, that it is banking on basically over force concentrating with and overcoming all obstacles using just four very, very strong, powerful, durable regiments. We start with an Archimandrite with Consecrated Mitre. Now, in this list, Consecrated Mitre will theoretically allow the Archimandrite to reach anything up to Priest 11 if it hits full Dark Power, which does open up some relatively scary offensive spellcasting, and otherwise just makes his support spells, in particular healing, very, very, very reliable. He'll be sitting in just a unit of 3 Legionnaires, as the rest of his warband consists of a 5-strong unit of Karez and 2 5-strong units of Bone Golems. Now, these 3 regiments alone collectively account for a huge portion of the list and are 3 of the 4 regiments that have led me to calling this list a kind of a 4-unit special. Anyone who has played Old Dominion in their current and even previous incarnations will be well aware of how dangerous some of these pieces are. There is almost no regiment in the entire event up to and theoretically including those 8 strong regiments of Braves that those Karez can't at least theoretically one-shot. Insanity is a potentially wildly swingy spell, but when you have that many spellcasting dice, right, you have 10 dice coming out of those Karez just most of the time, sufficient number of successes will typically be inflicted to smooth out at least a little bit of the swinginess and produce a great deal of damage. And then every now and again, they won't do everything, and then some of the time, they will just blow 20 to 30 wounds off of a regiment because your opponent rolled a few 6s. Bone Golems are, of course, Bone Golems, one of the premier heavy regiments in the game. Yes, their clash is a little bit low, they can also be a bit swingy due to being low clash but relentless blows, but they have tons of wounds and aura of death, they just grind and punch, and these 5 strong regiments do have some additional synergy when we get to the Warlord, which is a Strategos. We then have a Hero Deacon. Eleuthera, Giver of Mercy on the Hero Deacon, tells me that you had 10 points spare. And there is nothing wrong with spending 10 points on the Hero Deacon, but between that and the Consecrated Mitre and a few other upgrades, I do wonder if maybe we could have seen some changes to this list somewhere. The Hero Deacon will be sitting most likely in this unit of 3 Legionnaires with a Dark Cenotaph, which will do some additional Dark Power generation. Because that is in fact the only regiment in the Hero Deacon's warband. So we have Dark Power coming from that Hero Deacon. It wants to get onto a zone, generate Dark Power passively using the Dark Cenotaph, and then generate Dark Power itself. The full engine there, everyone at this point I think is fairly familiar with it, but the Hero Deacon will cast a spell every turn to generate Dark Power, and will often sacrifice a stand from a regiment, which the Archimandrite will then heal back to generate some Dark Power. When you add on top of that the Dark Cenotaph, you can progress up through Dark Power tiers very quickly. I personally have not found the Dark Cenotaph to be remotely necessary. I have found that you will typically hit plentiful Dark Power tiers with just the Archimandrite and the Hero Deacon by themselves, particularly when you get to what I would call the virtualized Dark Power the list has access to, both through the Archimandrite and the Strategos. And so here we have Strategos Warlord. He has a unit of Legionnaires with an Optio, but then also kind of the cookie cutter Old Dominion, oh, it's this crap again, regiment, which is Eternal Discipline. So we have Untouchable, Tenacious, Aura of Death 4 between the Legio Primigenia and the Profane Reliquary Standard Bearer. This regiment arrives as if it were a light. Often it will be arriving. I would personally have this arrive in a similar location to like the Karez would move in support of this. So yes, it's only 2 light regiments, but you want to come and pick a fight with those. Tremendously powerful, tremendously dangerous, able to endure quite a lot of negative attention. These regiments might be very slightly vulnerable to some of the really, really aggressive light play that we have seen from certain other lists, some of the like Wadroon light heavy lists, for example, but even those lists don't necessarily want to come within punching range of these regiments. They'll be relying on activation advantage to get a degree of control and launch attacks on their own terms if they want to close with these 2 light regiments. Now, the Strategos Warlord, there are 3 effects to his Supremacy ability. One of the reasons why he's my personal favorite Warlord, by a small margin, my personal favorite Warlord in the Old Dominion. Firstly, he allows you to reach Dark Power Tier 4, which I expect this list can absolutely do. Dark Power Tier 4 doesn't do that much in terms of additional effects to the army. The real money is at Dark Power Tier 2 and Tier 3, but it makes your army a little more terrifying. But any effects that scale off Dark Power will scale off of that Tier 4. That includes the automatic hits from the Hero Deacon spells, the extra wounds from the Karez Insanity, and of course the Archimandrite's Aura of Death and Healing spells, both of which he'll have a very easy time casting if he wants to. The Consecrated Mitre as an artifact also scales off of Dark Power, which is how this priest might be able to reach Priest 11 in this list. Now, the third thing, the activatable ability, or second and third thing, the activated ability that the Strategos Supremacy gives you is for one turn, you count your Dark Power as if it were a tier higher. Now, that doesn't impact things like the Karez spellcasting, etc. It's just regiments get the bonuses of Dark Power a tier higher. But it also gives every regiment in the army a free reform. And when you have regiments that are as wide as Bone Golems or Karez, or can play as wide with 5 stands, that allows a lot of threat extension because you have all of that benefit of fluid formation on a regiment that is wide enough to fully capitalize. Now, Bone Golems using this won't necessarily threat as far as some of the extreme threat range Wood Rune pieces that we've seen, but if they're willing to, because it's not fluid formation, march, reform, charge, those regiments will inflict 10 low clash impact attacks and 20 Aura of Death hits, which certainly is very dangerous at that very long threat range. Karez similarly can Memories of Old as a draw event, march, reform, and then cast Insanity with a very long very long threat range, right? So it's going to be 6 plus kind of 5 or 6 plus 10, which is sufficient to start to out-threaten some of even those very long threat range regiments, those Raptor Riders, etc. that we saw. And so overall, this gives us a list that has 4 very, very strong regiments. We have the Karez, the Bone Golems, and the Praetorians, with just some Legionnaires present to score and caddy around spellcasters and support the list. Plenty of the list scores, plenty of the list fights. It is overall well-rounded. Now, for my money, if I was to offer some critique of this, I would say it is getting a little bit luxury-ish in terms of unit upgrades. Things like the Consecrated Mitre, Eleuthera on the Hero Deacon, the full 6th stand of Praetorians, even some of the upgrades for the Strategos, to be perfectly honest. You can run that Praetorian regiment a little bit lighter if you need to save points. Even the Optio, to an extent, you have those Praetorians arriving very early in the game. The Optio on the second unit of or the third unit of Legionnaires is not hugely necessary. The Dark Cenotaph is not hugely necessary. You could quite easily run the Hero Deacon, for example, in a unit of Cultists, and in some respects, your Dark Power generation would be accelerated just a little bit. And all of those changes would actually add up to, if you really wanted them to, quite a lot of points that could be directed just into more force. If we cut 25 points off the Consecrated Mitre, 25 points off the, or 20 points off the Dark Cenotaph, 15 points off the Optio, 10 points off Eleuthera, 40 points, 45 points off of a stand of Praetorian Guard, we actually start getting close to just a whole another regiment that we can begin adding into this list. And particularly if we were willing to trim down some of the Bone Golem regiments, we actually genuinely could. You could start adding like a whole unit of Canophores or Caryatids, which would give you a really meaningful additional capability to the list, and another regiment, another scoring regiment, etc. And so while I think this list is very powerful and very direct, and there is a great deal of advantage to having a list that is a bit uncomplicated, right? Chios is only 4 rounds, but they will be 4 rounds against very good opponents. So and you will have traveled from across the world. There is merit to having a list that is a bit less complicated than it otherwise might be to play. But my personal take is that this list has room for optimization. I think it's very strong. I think it's using Old Dominion things that are very strong. I think it can kind of just muscle its way through quite a lot of opposition off the back of the sheer mechanical power that Old Dominion have right now. And I suspect that mechanical power has not driven it to optimize those last 100, 150 odd points that might otherwise have gotten just a little bit more versatility, a little bit more capability into this list that you can really have pay dividends when you're playing against players that are as skilled in practice as everyone will be at Chios. Now, next up, we have the second of 2 Old Dominion lists. This is, God help me, Arcadius, I think, and I'm not even going to attempt Arcadius's second name. Arcadius is our second Old Dominion player and our 4th player from Poland, which makes them the second most represented region next to the United States, although the United States, with 5 players, was split across 2 regions. Now, this is a Heliarch Warlord list that I can only describe as perfectly honed and straight out of 2003. This is the kind of list that like I was running and really enjoying literally a year, like more than a year ago. And I can speak to its quality. It's only gotten better. In some respects, the emergence of the Strategos kind of displaced the Heliarch, and that I don't think was necessarily fair. The Heliarch Warlord is still very good, and there are some strengths in this list that I think are worth highlighting depending on what your expectations on the meta were going into here. So, how is the list structured? We have a Heliarch kind of pretending to be a more dangerous Strategos. He's got a unit of 3 Legionnaires and an Optio, but he is kitted out with Legio Primigenia, Aventine Armor, Eternal Discipline in a unit, in this case, of 4 Praetorian Guard. Now, this is a point I will actually lightly critique. Yes, Aura of Death 4 is very, very good, but the Heliarch's Warlord ability is exceptional. The Supremacy ability, in addition to enabling you to reach Dark Power Tier 4, is every regiment in his warband once per game, you pop the Supremacy, you get an additional free clash. So free additional means regiments can march and charge clash clash, or clash charge clash, or march charge clash. But you can, if you need to, do 2 clashes, and we can see 2 regiments of 4 Varangian guards that are there to deliver absolute hammer blows off the back of that supremacy. The Praetorian Guard, by comparison, are kind of just aping a Strategos' regiment, where, like, yes, you're doing the thing the Strategos did, but the Strategos' supremacy helps those Praetorians engage from a really long way away. The Heliarch's does not, and the Heliarch is really dangerous in close combat. So I almost wish this regiment, which is only running to 4 stands, you could trim a bunch of stuff out of this, right? You could exchange Legio Primigenia for Calamitas, which significantly increases the Heliarch's damage output. And then if you cut the Profane Reliquary and Eternal Discipline, you've got points for a whole nother stand of Praetorian Guard. Now, ultimately, Aura of Death 4, very good. Getting really high defense, very good. Aventine Armor and Eternal Discipline. Like, there's nothing wrong with this as a setup, but I think it's probably trying to be something. It could be a purer expression of the strengths of the Heliarch's warband and what the Heliarch is doing, and I think instead it's choosing to kind of be a Strategos we have at home, when the Heliarch should be trying to do something different. Nevertheless, this is a very powerful, very dangerous warband, and I'm talking a little bit at the end of this why I think this list has some very interesting merits depending on your assessment of the Chios meta. We then have a Hero Deacon. The Hero Deacon doesn't have anything special going on, it's just doing wonderful Hero Deacon things in a unit of Legionnaires, no bells and whistles here. We then have a 4-strong unit of Caryatids. These are long-range, dangerous, size 2 statues. They are perfectly suited for standing behind things like, for example, very durable Praetorian Guard regiments and firing over the top. I like these a lot. We then have an Archimandrite. Again, nothing special. Archimandrite doesn't really need anything extra going on. His spellcasting is very solid. His healing, for example, will go very, very well with the Praetorian Guards. Again, just in 3 Legionnaires, nothing special, and a unit of 4 Bone Golems. Now, 4 Bone Golems means this list has 3 heavies. On turn 3, you'll typically auto on probably a unit of Varangian Guard. At that point, you have a 75% chance of bringing on 1 other heavy, which I imagine will often also be a regiment of Varangian Guard, because what you'll be trying to do is posture the Praetorians and the Varangian Guard, those 3 very dangerous regiments, to deliver a hammer blow using the Heliarch supremacy that gets you into the game. Gets you powerfully ahead, or recovers your position if you were behind, like whatever. To aid that, you have this unit of Caryatids, which can shoot over all of your size 1 regiments. Often they'll be standing behind, for example, the Praetorian Guard. And the range 20 high damage output of the Caryatids helps serve to push your opponent toward you, otherwise you'll just continue to fire away with the Caryatids, at least partially equalize the range gain, but ideally pull your opponent towards you so you can launch that kind of an alpha strike. Now, with the exception of my critique of how the Heliarch's personal regiment of Praetorian Guard is configured, this list is running very, very lean. There is no wasted upgrades. Everything is in service of the list's overall objectives. Everything is in service of making the individual regiments do what they need to do. And that speaks to a very, very honed list. In addition, this list is very, very well suited to the mirror match. Now, obviously, there are only 2 Old Dominion players at Chios. We couldn't know, right, how many Old Dominion players there were going to be, but Old Dominion were not exactly a boogeyman of the competitive matter. Old Dominion right now, September 2024, are fearsome bullies of casual play, mostly because it is impossible to play a casual game against Old Dominion. You must be on point against them for 100% of the game, because if you don't, they will make the game sweaty due to their rubber banding mechanism that pulls them to a degree of power by turn 5 or turn 6 or turn 7, which makes casual play against them basically impossible. In competition play, where everyone is 100% on all the time and playing, sweaty Conquest, they aren't quite as strong. They are a very, very strong faction, but it was always going to be a bit of a roll of the dice as to would we see tons of Old Dominion at Road to Chios or just some. As it happens, we've seen just some. But if you asked me to pick out a list that was very well suited to the Old Dominion mirror, I would pick something like this. The Varangian Guard, the threat range, like the pure threat range you get from the Heliarch, exceeds that of the Strategos. You've got Aura of Death, which is very good in the matchup, in the mirror matchup. You have Armor Piercing 2 Caryatids, which, unlike Karez, are fully online against Old Dominion. They're not reliant on Insanity, which doesn't work against OD. And Varangian Guard hit hard enough to punch through all of the harden that you see on OD's more elite things. This is a really well-honed, well-structured list. Like, for example, if this list was to play into the Strategos list that we just saw, I would, setting aside player skill, I would expect this list to be favored. Maybe not hugely, because the other list does still have 10 stands of Bone Golems, but if those Varangian Guard on the Heliarch's feet turn contact the Praetorian Regiment, for example, they'll do tremendous damage to it. And the Strategos list, in terms of range, all it's really got are the Karez, which aren't that much of a threat to an Old Dominion list, whereas this list has those Caryatids, which will be plugging away, dealing damage, minting value, incenting the opponent, like pressuring the opposing list to push into this list. Now, as it's happened, that's not what we are seeing. That's not the meta that has emerged in Chios. What we see in Chios are a pretty interesting mix of middleweight versus extreme lightweight versus extreme heavyweight style of lists. We are seeing all aspects of the game being played, and so this Heliarch list is instead just a really solid Heliarch Warlord list. It punches very hard, it's quite durable, it's got tons of stands, it fights well, it's not easy to grapple with, it's got good support, it's just very, very well rounded and very well honed. Of the two, I would say this is my favorite of the two Old Dominion lists that we have seen. And if we had seen a Chios meta that had 4 or 5 Old Dominion lists, this would be an absolute winner. Instead, I think it's merely very good, but I do think it's very good. Up next, we have our Soul, but we do have present a Nords player, Peter, whose last name I can't pronounce, from the United States, running a Nords list that I really like. Now, one of the things to sort of like acknowledge around Nords is that even though aesthetically they may include some very, very large muscular men, in terms of playstyle, at least as currently designed, they play very much almost like Wood Elves. And this is a list that leans really cleanly and really heavily into that style of play. I'll break down different bits and pieces of synergies over the course of sort of the list assessment as we go through, but in short, this list is playing a Wood Elf game. It's got one really big monster, it's got some very dangerous, kind of fast, pressuring range regiments, some okay melee, and it's on the board quickly and able to score early. This is probably tied for the most aggressive scoring game that we have seen, kind of alongside maybe Carl's Spires. So although it's further down on the second page, this is a Jarl Warlord list, which means that characters in light regiments allow those regiments to score. Bear that in mind, we're going to expect to see basically every character in a light regiment to maximize that. So first up we have a Blooded. Blooded has Dragon, which gives it +1 Clash, moving up to Clash 4, and the Hunt's Instinct. Now, the presence of the Hunt's Instinct means that the Blooded is going to be going into one of these 2 units of Bow Chosen. He has 3 Trolls, 3 Trolls, 3 Bone Chosen, 3 Bow Chosen, 3 Bow Chosen. Dragon is an interesting choice here, because with Hunt's Instinct he's going to be joining a unit of Bow Chosen. Normally you might expect, therefore, to pick Crow as his aspect to get a bonus to his ranged attack. What Dragon says to me is that this regiment is looking to be able to quickly destroy objectives. Dragon is very marginally less good in melee than I think it's Wolf that gives you +1 attack, +1 clash on 6 attacks. Actually, no, sorry, I'm wrong with that. Sorry. +1 clash on 6 attacks on average generates 1 dice roll, because usually you'll be inspired and therefore re-rolling 6s, which means that on average you will re-roll 1 6, which is the same as giving yourself +1 attack. Sorry, so Dragon is a close combat choice. As good as +1 attack, except that the Blooded has impact attacks, which means that you are getting your bonus to clash off of those as well. And by having Clash 4, you have a reasonably good chance of dealing some impact hits. There's only 2 of them, but 2 impact hits as part of a charge on an objective might be just enough to do a wound, which is maybe just enough to deal some damage, which is just enough to kill an objective. You could have gone with Crow instead. Dragon, I think, is the subtle choice. It gives the regiment a little bit more melee punch, and it gives the regiment that ability, assuming he's joining Bochosen, which I think he will be, to just maybe one-shot an objective, or deal 2 wounds in a round to an objective that you otherwise would have to take a little bit longer to kill. So I like that a lot. Bochosen, of course, are short-ranged but quite dangerous ranged units that can, if they absolutely need to, fight in melee, and they're costed accordingly. We've then got a Blooded with Dragon, Barrage, etc. He'll be joining either a unit of Stalkers or probably a unit of Bochosen, but that is something that he could change depending on the scenario. I suspect most of the time he will be in Bochosen though, and the Stalkers maybe will be arriving a little bit later using their Vanguard to catch up. Although, of course, sorry, the Stalkers have flank. Sorry, and because the Stalkers have flank, and because Blood give forward force, yes, I very much expect the Blood to go in the Bochosen. That also means we have basically the entire set of light regiments. I think we got another unit of trolls here. That's our 3rd troll regiment. I am pretty sure, yes. So on the first turn, you will have a unit of Bochosen that you will auto on, a unit of raiders with flank, a unit of stalkers with flank, and then 2 more units of Bochosen with flank. Yeah, so this list, its whole army arrives on the first turn. It has no need to roll for reserves, thanks to all of the forward force, which grants flank, and 3 of those regiments can score. Now, the trolls, of course, will arrive at their own pace, as will the Sea Jotnar, the last thing we see here. But 3 of those light regiments can score. The list is very good at killing objectives, and then the list sort of follows up with trolls and the Sea Jotnar. The skirmishing phase is the make or break for this list. Now, the range damage one of the things we can see about this list is that every regiment apart from the Sea Jotnar is infantry, and that plays into the Jarl Supremacy. So the Jarl Supremacy will enable those light regiments with characters to score. It also gives every infantry regiment Opportunist. Now, Opportunist on the trolls is nice if you get a flank charge. Where Opportunist really comes into its own is when those Bochosen or Stalkers start making attacks into the flank of a regiment. It's very easy even to just get a couple of stands into the flank of a regiment when you're using ranged units, at which point they start getting full rerolls, which plays very well into, like, they're already volley 3 with a large number of attacks and precise shot. Precise shot interacts kind of nicely with rerolls. You have those extra chances to roll 1s, which means that the damage this list can put out if it gets crossfire, right? If you start getting flank shots with the different range regiments, if you can just manage the relatively short range of the Bochosen at 14, is some prodigious damage, which can clear the way to move on to objectives to score, which can then open up early scoring game. And you basically are looking to play that, like, aggressive scoring game, aggressive, like, skirmishing ranged game, and use that to get yourself far enough ahead and maybe secure some localized victories that you secure a part of the table, you get a scoring advantage, and you coast that through to the win. Because obviously what this list is not is big and heavy, right? The closest thing you have to durable melee regiments are the trolls, which, yes, they can regenerate, but trolls, right, they're defense 2, resolve 3. If they're very relatively easy to break. Like, 6 wounds is nice, but it's still relatively easy to break a troll regiment, and once you break a troll regiment, they can't regenerate, even with Oblivious, etc. So this list really does need to maximize the concentration of power with its ranged units to both get in the game early, score early, get picks against enemy regiments, push them back early, and then coast that through to a win. This is another list that is playing a really aggressive light game, and it would be very interesting to see how this list plays into something like, for example, the list from Singapore with the 16 stands of Raptor Riders. The fact that those Raptor Riders can just about hit the Bochosen from outside of their range, their threat range even, is scary. But on the other hand, Bochosen are maybe durable enough to survive that and take the crack back, particularly if some crossfire comes into play. Either way, that would promise to be a game that would be Basically, turn 3 or 4, and you could probably just about call it. I would suspect one way or the other, the game will resolve very quickly, and it'll be super interesting to sit down and watch. Again, if they do any live streaming for Chios, that's a matchup that I would be very keen to see. I actually have no idea who would win that. There are very different, as much as both of the lists are playing a very early game, the strengths that each is bringing to that game is very, very different. Now, this is also a list that I think I kind of like. Into Old Dominion, for example. Bow Chosen are a regiment that can get some pretty meaningful damage onto things like Bone Golems. Now, they can't necessarily put down Bone Golem regiments before they contact, but you can. If a Bone Golem regiment comes hard into your list, you can collapse in on the flanks, do some pretty significant damage with things like Precise Shot, limit the damage Aura of Death can do, pick it apart, if it makes that, like, sort of that steep run into you. I'd also note that at 12 activations, this list has the third highest activation count, although once you start talking 10, 11, 12, not a great deal of difference. It's only once you push up into 13 activations that you start being like, yep, this is an activation heavy list. I think overall, this is a list that I have no critique of. I think the list is absolutely, it's taking risks. It's all very light. None of the units are especially durable, but some of them are maybe more durable than you might necessarily think at first glance. But it's not a particularly robust list. It is a Nords list that is leaning into the Wood Elf archetype that they are designed to lean into. There is no upgrade, I think, that is wasted. Everything is solid. It's making really full use of the Jarl's supremacy. It's committed to a strategy, and it will pretty much be down to execution and matchup to see how well Peter goes. Next up, we have our sole Dweghom player, Daniel McMahon from Region E in the USA, so one of, I think, 5 USA players, running what I can really only describe as a modern classic Dweghom list. Now, the only way that this list could be more kind of on meta is there are a few things that you could do, but this is how I think you want to be running broadly a Tempered Steelshaper Warlord, which is the notable innovation question mark that this list is making. Tempered Steel Shapers versus Tempered Sorcerers. Like the Tempered Creed is pretty comfortably the probably competitive best Dweghom Creed. Obviously, it's competing with the Ardent Creed or No Creed loser if you're playing a Hold Reg, or the Ardent Creed if you're playing an Ardent Kerouac. The Ardent Creed is very good. It's very solid. There's a lot of play in the Ardent Creed. But I think we can probably say the Tempered Creed is pretty consistent. Now, if you want to play Tempered Creed, that means you play either a Tempered Sorcerer or a Tempered Steel Shaper. Historically, Tempered Sorcerers have been the more popular Warlord. Tempered Sorcerer Warlord gets 2 spells. Their spells are very powerful. The Tempered Steel Shaper is a little bit more difficult to maximize and play because he generates nominally fewer tokens, right? The Tempered Sorcerer Warlord gets a whole extra spell, which generates a whole extra token, which means you have more wounds that you can prevent, is usually how you'll use those tokens. By comparison, the Tempered Steel Shaper introduces something that is otherwise basically unknown for Dweghom, which is healing. Whenever you spend tokens on a regiment with the Tempered Steel Shaper, then the Tempered Steel Shaper is in your army. For the first 3 tokens that you spend, you heal that many wounds. Now, 3 tokens is just enough. 3 wounds is just enough to restore a stand to play, but more than that, it effectively doubles down on the wound prevention that these tokens like create. So if you're a defense 3 regiment and you're taking, a hit maybe at cleave 1, spending a token means you don't need to roll a dice, which prevents in effect 2/3 of a wound. By spending a token with a Tempered Steel Shaper, you prevent 1 and 2/3 of a wound because you heal 1 and prevent the 2/3, which is a really significant return on investment. And so, for this reason, I think, particularly at the higher levels of play, there's always been a pretty firm acknowledgement that there is something there for the Tempered Steel Shaper, but that it required discovery, as opposed to Tempered Sorcerer Warlord, which just works. A Tempered Steel Shaper, you need to learn the play patterns. You need to learn how to bank up and expend your tokens slightly differently to a Tempered Sorcerer. And so I think really like only a bit further into this current update season, we're beginning to see Tempered Steel Shapers emerge. And it's really cool to see one at the Road to Heos, in particular to see one over a more classical, but I think probably less refined Tempered Sorcerer. So what we have here is Tempered Sorcerer, Magma School, Hellbringer, Fireforged, Hellbringer, and then just copy and paste that entire warband. It's all the same again, so it'll be a Tempered Sorcerer riding the Drake and a unit of Fireforged. We then have a Tempered Steel Shaper. Lava Shots gives him Precise Shot on his pretty reasonable set of ranged attacks. He will be joining either these Hold Ballistae or the Fireforged. I'm actually not sure which, really could go either way. 6 wide Hold Ballistae is a little bit difficult to maximize. You might be pushing units into the back rank, which means he could go into the Fireforged, but on the other hand, I think he kind of synergizes a little more nicely with the Hold Ballistae. Very, very hard to say. Could go in either. But we have him. We then have 5 Hold Ballistae with Herald of Magma. Now, 5 is wide, you get a fair bit of shots out of that. They're a little more durable as a result. Herald of Magma gives them Aura of Death 2, which means 10 hits out of that regiment, and more importantly, it turns any piece of terrain they're touching into an erupting piece of terrain, which the Tempered Sorcerers with Magma can then play off of. Now, this is actually really important when you aren't running a Tempered Sorcerer Warlord. When you're running a Tempered Sorcerer Warlord, you can use your 1 free spell to throw out a piece of terrain that is erupting, and then you can throw your Magma Eruption from your offensive spell from that, and the second sorcerer can do the same, which means that you can get 2 offensive spells out of your sorcerers to do some damage to get that attritional lead that you need to. With no Tempered Sorcerer Warlord, if you want 2 offensive spells out of your sorcerers, you need to have access to erupting terrain, and the Hold Ballistae help take care of that. They also answer a question that this kind of a list can otherwise struggle with, which is that this list, in my experience, doesn't want to break formation. It wants to keep its power together and project overwhelming force into one part of the table, win there decisively, and move on. If this list spreads out, all of the things that you have basically in front of your Hellbringer Drakes can begin to crumple. Like, Fireforged are tough, but they're not invincible. And if the Hellbringer Drakes get engaged on, you very, very quickly learn that they are less durable than most of your MSUs. Defense 3, Evasion 2, Resolve 3, and 14 wounds is fine, but that is a 335 point investment once you account for the sorcerer on top. They are extremely attractive targets, and so you need to keep your formation intact in front of them. And if you keep your formation intact and you push that overwhelming firepower out, you have all of these guns in one place, it's very difficult to close with them without being punished. The downside of that is that you don't necessarily have force projection elsewhere on the table. To resolve that issue, we have a Herald of Magma on those Ballistae, which can deploy elsewhere away from all of the big unpiercing 2 guns. They can put out their shots, and if anything moves to engage them, you can reinforce them at a distance because they're touching a piece of terrain, and that piece of terrain starts spewing magma into whatever is engaging them. So it's very clean. It allows the list to play on more parts of the table, which is a capability that the list really needs. We've then got a unit of Fireforged and 2 units of Steelforged. These are the only melee units in the entire list, but they're good quality melee units. Steelforged, I think, for the cost these days, are solidly fair. They put out plenty of hits, they play well with basically what they... And like Defense 4, Resolve 4, 5 wounds is an excellent stat line to be making full use of the Steel Shaper's ability, the Steel Shaper's Supremacy ability. Now, some of the other pros of this list is that, with the exception of the 1 Hold Ballistae regiment, it's all medium, which gives you a kind of pleasingly smooth reinforcement curve. You can be pretty much guaranteed with, what have we got, 6 medium regiments, that a lot of the time you'll have, not always, but a lot of the time you'll have 3 turning up on turn 2. Not 6, sorry, yeah, 7. 7 medium regiments. So yeah, a lot of the time you'll have 3 turning up on turn 2, you'll auto 1, you'll roll 6 dice, 2 successes. That's a nice, clean and predictable reinforcement curve. And you can start, building up the tokens, banking up that collection of tokens that you'll need to really maximize the Tempered Steel Shaper's power. Now, in terms of weaknesses that this list has, if it breaks formation, it can be in serious trouble. Almost none of these range regiments fight particularly well in melee. That includes the Hellbringer Drakes. They're not good melee regiments with only 8 attacks. You can use the spells of the Tempered Sorcerers to try and unpick yourself from melee, but Fire Wizards, these are not. Like Fireballs, yes, those will unpick a ranged regiment. The sacrifice that you're making by giving up your fire regiments is raw magical offensive power. The benefit of the Magma School is that you will much more consistently generate tokens, and you will have an easier time projecting force through the Hold Ballisto. That's a bit of a choice. I think we went through a period where it was just all Magma all the time. Having played a number of games recently against Fire Wizards, I am coming back around to tokens are nice, but raw offensive damage is also very relevant. But I think this kind of list is trying to maximize the power of the Tempered Steel Shaper, and it's doing that quite well. No heavies obviously means that you are very reliant on all of your guns to secure yourself a local advantage, push forward through that. 2 melee regiments in the entire list is a little bit scary, particularly if we run into, for example, a list that is very resilient to anti-range attacks. We haven't seen too many of those yet. There are plenty of lists with some loose formation, but there are not that many lists that really just say, no, I don't care particularly much about your guns. I think this list will actually match up quite well into some of the heavy skew lists. Armor Piercing 2 is enough to start punching through Hardened. Even the 12 Ashen Dawn list that we will see relatively soon, you kind of have the firepower to put a dint in some of those regiments as they close and hold them up long enough to deal with them. I feel like this list might struggle with stuff like the very, very aggressive Wardrune, where it will very much be a battle of holding its formation and getting its token count up. Those Wardrune lists might be trying to close the game out before you have a chance to build up enough of a token margin to really make use of the Steel Shaper Supremacy ability. So it will very much be a case of keeping your position, holding a small amount of the table, and then pushing out from there, rather than trying to fight across a broad front and getting overwhelmed by this sort of wide early Wardrune armies that just have many, many more lights than even you have meat. Like many more lights, much more board presence than you will have, just bringing your mediums on at a usual pace. I do overall, otherwise, though, think this list is very solid. I can see every decision that has been made in the construction of this list makes a great deal of sense. It's obviously very well practiced and very well honed. I don't have any changes I think I would make. Every decision that is present here is toward a certain edge. So I could say, oh, well, you could do things like you could put in another character for more token generation, but that would thin the list out. I could say, oh, well, it would be great to get a heavy in, but that would require taking something like a Hold Thane, which is a 4th character, and etc. This list is trying to do a very pure thing. It's trying to present a great deal of guns. I even like, for example, the fact that it hasn't. It would have been very tempting to put an Ardent Kerouac in Flame Berserkers. That gives you a light scoring regiment. It turns up early. The Ardent Kerouac does generate tokens. The decision not to, I think, is correct, because what this list needs, right, in addition to generating tokens, what this list needs is to be thick and durable enough to make those tokens matter. And one of the things that you will find with Flame Berserkers is that they're actually kind of a little easy to punch through some of the time. So overall, I would say this is a very well-honed list, very solid. I know expect it. I think it will be interesting to see in particular how it performs into some of the extremes that are present at Chios, but overall, very solid and very well-rounded. So we're into city-states. Now, I have been recording for almost 2 hours, and I'm getting a little flagged. This is usually, in these videos, what happens to Wardrune, where I just breeze through the Wardrune. They'll be fine. The city-states list are very interesting, and I'm going to try and do them justice, but we are going to push a little bit more quickly through the city-states and 100 Kingdoms to get toward the end of this video. The first of these city-states list is Reese King from Australia, running the only Polemarch warlord. The other 2 are Aristarch warlords. There are 3 city-states players. And I think just as a general appraisal of the city-states lists, we are seeing, apart from the fact that Scorpios are maybe very slightly overtuned, literally very slightly, we are seeing some really nice kind of well-rounded lists. There's no skew basically here at all, which theoretically someone could probably have spent more than $1,000 on a sufficiently large quantity of chariots. No one has elected to. That might just be a financial constraint. But broadly, we're seeing some quite well-balanced, well-rounded lists. And we start with Reese's list. So he has a Polemarch Warlord. The Polemarch has Arista for some really nice threat extension and Atlantis Spear. Wonderful, wonderful artifact on the Polemarch just for juicing up its damage. It'll be in a unit of 5 Agama with the Andromarchos. Then we have a Talos. We then have an Aristarch with now Aristarch has taken long lineage to get both the Blades of Ecades and the impact resistance, which means that with his battlefield orders, you will have Untouchable and Tenacious on a very, very big big block of hoplites. This is an 8-strong block of hoplites, including with a Minotaur Haspest, which means this is a thick regiment. This is probably the single most durable regiment that we have seen in the event so far, equaled only by the War Fanatic Blooded that we saw in Wardrune. And even then, whether or not Defense for Blessed is as good as Defense for Reroll 6's Tenacious, I would kind of make the argument that the wound count for the Blooded Braves helps salvage them, but this Hoplite Regiment might be more durable. It's very, very tough and is a par excellence anvil, in addition to being dangerous, yeah, kind of off the back of the Hoplites, but mostly off the back of that Blades of Echides Aristarch. Rounding out that warband, we have 2 War Chariots. Then we get into our third warband, which is a Mechanist with the Standard of Last Oration, which will enable scoring in a light regiment. He'll be joining this little unit of Thorakides, then a unit of 4 Inquisitors. Now, until we got to this Mechanist regiment, I would say this is just gold standard city-state stuff. This is gold standard good city-state stuff, which I would observe is kind of Reese's mainstay, right? Big unit of hoplites, couple of chariots to support, solid unit of Agamar. You have tough, dangerous. You add in the Talos, and you've got 2 nice anvil regiments, which is really like kind of a sweet spot. 2 regiments that can hold really nicely. Some range support, some nice threat range with the Agamar. This is just solid, well-rounded skill expression. We start seeing the unique flourishes Reese is putting on it when we get to Warband 3. So we've got some early scoring. Now, having looked at some of the other lists that we're seeing, that Mechanist unit is going to be sitting there saying, I'm in danger, because holy damn, there are some offensive light regiments in the event broadly. And so my expectation is that those Thorakides will turn up, they will very conservatively claim some space, and then they will use Flawed Formation to back the hell out if they are being pressured aggressively. Now, I would not say that their survival is essential, but they are still absolutely an asset. They're a 255-point asset, in point of fact. The spells from the Mechanist are, you could take them or leave them, but he does unlock the Inquisitors, and the Inquisitors are interesting as a flex, and that's sort of where we get to the second thing. Now, Inquisitors actually are kind of where my experience with city-states runs out a little bit. I think I've played against these like once ever. And if I'm being perfectly honest, that's mostly because it's taking a little while for my locals to paint them. We have city-states players in Canberra. We have quite good city-states players in Canberra, and they own Inquisitors. But assembly and then painting has been something of a challenge. So I haven't actually seen them in play particularly much, but they have a very aggressive kind of stat line. Movement 7, unstoppable. You could just make the movement 7 with a 5-inch plus 5-inch guaranteed charge, which is a 12-inch threat, which is pretty significant if you want to use the Arista from the polemark. And then you just have an awful lot of attacks with flurry and cleave and impacts. It's a great deal of damage. This is not a regiment that is durable exactly. 5 wounds, evasion 2, resolve 5 is maybe just durable enough if they get the jump on something to not be vulnerable to Shattermass. Now, the list is presenting enough other threats that I expect the Inquisitors can broadly be kept safe by use of things like their threat range and the strat stack and support from other regiments. Where I would start to worry for them is firstly in situations where they're just cleanly out-threatened. So like some of the Wardrune lists, in fact all of the Wardrune lists, which have very long threat range melee regiments, the Inquisitors don't out-threat Chosen of Conquest. Now, Chosen of Conquest coming into Inquisitors probably don't shatter them. But that's a fight that's rough for the Inquisitors if they don't get the jump. But when they're put in a position where they are supporting the tough, durable things like the Talos and that big unit of hoplites, I think that's probably where they would shine with their long melee threat range and their high melee damage. That's the kind of unit that you do want to support those big heavy anvils like this. Otherwise, I would say this is just a clean, solid, well-rounded city-states list that is trying to play all parts of the game. It's got 1 light regiment to do some early scoring, maybe set some reserve lines, but mostly I expect this list to turn up off of its own table edge, adopt a formation, fight a mutually supporting game, use the threat range on the Agama potentially to get a pick, otherwise play conservatively, use its mix of range and anvil play to slowly push the game forward. Just play, like this list is kind of an example of how, although if you talk to city-states players, I expect you will still hear some complaints about internal balance of the faction. medium infantry, for example. We have two very sort of closely competing medium infantry with spear regiments. But in terms of how the faction plays generally, particularly with the addition of chariots to the list, you have a faction that just plays all of Conquest in a really nice way. And this is a list that kind of does that. What that means is that when it encounters lists that are pushing a skew, it will need to play to its own strengths against that skew. The fact that if it just doesn't, if the that block of hoplites doesn't get flanked, it can probably tank like literally the entire army of that Wardrune list that Benjamin is playing with 16 Stance Raptors, right? If it just keeps the flanks of those hoplites clear, those hoplites take almost no damage from attacks from that regiment. If it just plays that mutually supporting game, then all of it works very well, but it has to use those strengths that it has when it plays into those skews. If it plays into the Ashen Dawn list that I've mentioned multiple times now, it needs to find its edges against such a weight of metal, using, for example, the fact that it starts scoring earlier than the Ashen Dawn does. So it has edges in each list, in each matchup, and it wants to look for those edges, and in that respect, it's a really nice list. Now, next up, and in a very similar vein, we have Matthius. Again, not going to attempt to pronounce that surname. Matthius, I think, is probably another Polish player from the basis of that surname, running a very similar vein list, a list that is just good and solid city-states that is trying to play all parts of the game. In this case, we don't have Impact of Impact Resistance Long Lineage on the Aristarch. We have an Aristarch Warlord, which is cool to see. Aristarch Warlord is really nice. We have just Blades of Ecades, in this instance in a 6+ Haspest Auxiliary Hoplite brick, so it is a bit less durable, like a bit less able to tank, but 6 Hoplites plus an Aristarch is still a good, tough list. With the points that it's been saved, it's widened the list out elsewhere. We have, in this instance, a 3-strong, just a little skirmishing regiment of Selenoi. Now, is a regiment of Selenoi as good as a Scorpios? You can actually go either way on that. I certainly think one unit of Selenoi is a very good addition to City-States list, as a counter skirmish, like as a skirmishing unit with loose formation, etc. But Selenoi are mainstay, and chariots are not. And the presence of Selenoi in this instance accommodates a Talos and then 3 Scorpios. So we're making full use of the AVA3 as a single selection Scorpios. Then we get into Warband 2, Polemarch with Arista and Atalanta Spear, much like we saw in Reese's list, but in this case, not the Warlord. Once again in an Agama unit, in this case only 4 Agama, but again with the Andromacho, so it's a little bit thinner. And with all of these like little things that we trim here and trim there, we get a whole unit of Minotaur Haspest and a second Talos. So that's the big thing that this list is doing. Yes, it has a smaller hoplite brick. In exchange, it has 2 whole Talos. And the Talos at this point still have flank. We know that they're losing that. But for now, still have flank, which means that the list has 5 regiments with flank. It arrives really nicely and consistently. I would imagine that those hoplites, maybe even the Agama as well, will sometimes stay behind. They won't if they don't succeed the reserve rolls on turn 2. The hoplites will arrive instead, which means you have really just a good, solid, wide line that has established itself by about turn 3. Now, this list is sitting at a nice healthy 11 activations, which I find is a really nice sweet spot for city-states. 11 puts you at really no more or no less than most other lists, but with the strategic stack to take advantage of as you would like if you wanted to play a control-style game using activation advantage. And generally, we're seeing here a relatively limited approach to unit upgrades in exchange for just a wider force. That makes this list, compared to Reese's, a little less technical, but a little more kind of failure tolerant. It is not trying to be complicated and spend a lot of points. Like if we look in particular, I made a point when we were talking about Carl's list that characters are a bit of a tax. Characters can absolutely add a lot of value and a lot of power to a list, but like that Polemarch, for example, is 140 points, and he punches good. That Polemarch is not going to kill 140 points of enemy units most games, and he is not adding that much resilience. He's adding his resolve attribute, but Agama are already resolve 3. The Polemarch is not adding much in the way of resilience relative to his points cost. If you could just take 3 more stands of Agama, that would absolutely add more damage and more resilience to the list than the Polemarch would. But the Polemarch is necessary because of how warband structures work, etc. Reese's regiment has 3 characters. The characters are all good, they're all doing important things. And the Mechanist is adding technicality to the list. It's adding a little bit of early scoring, it's adding a little bit of spellcasting, and importantly, interference, which can be a really big deal. And it's mobile interference that can pull back and be in a position where it needs to be later in the game if necessary. By comparison, Matthias's list has only 2 characters, which mean, and they're not heavily upgraded. They are cheaper, which means that it has maximum girth elsewhere, which means that it's got just a bit more fat in the list if something goes wrong, something goes upset. It's got like a whole extra unit kind of in places, etc. The only critique I would make is that I would really like to see something like the Premodynamic Globe in this list. Yes, spellcasting is not everywhere, but interference is important. There are lists in this event. Like, you had to know Old Dominion would be coming, and if Old Dominion were coming, that they would be bringing Karez. Interference against Karez is the difference between like whole units getting wiped out and whole units surviving. There is a 5 stack of Karez in this event, and there could easily have been more. We've got 1 Dweghom player and 2 Sorcerer Kings players. So in a sense, I would say that, okay, maybe Matthews kind of lucked out a little bit in that there is less spellcasting than there could have been. But if this had been an Old Dominion heavy event, or if this had been a Dweg heavy event, the absence of interference in this list could really add up. And the fact that Reese's list has this little unit that, in addition to unlocking a warband and some certain little tech pieces and early scoring, can pull back later in the game and just generate an interference bubble when needed. In some matchups, like if Karez are knocking on your door, for example, that's a piece of capability that this list is sorely missing. Now, can I suggest anything that I would cut? No, not really. This is a nice, well-honed 2,000 point list. All of the characters are at full upgrade bottle. You need to start doing something like cutting the Arista, and the Arista is really good, so I can't in good conscience say that it should be removed. It probably shouldn't. But just in terms of the broader capability of the list, and in the interest of, presenting some critique, I don't think this list needs or warrants much critique. Like I mentioned at the very beginning, everyone playing in this event is here for a reason, and these lists reflect that. But in the interest of talking about that, that is something that it would be nice to see. It's a weakness in this list that, hopefully, for Matthias's sake, doesn't materialize. But if he plays into like that Old Dominion list, for example, those Karez can one-shot a Talos. Everyone has heard that story. Everyone knows someone who has either one-shot or had a Talos one-shot by a unit of Karez. Interference is the kind of thing that helps ensure against that, and it's really the only thing that is missing from this otherwise very well-rounded and solid list. Now, for our third and final city-states list, we have Dustin Foran's city-states, and this is really cool to see because this is another archetype of city-states list. This is an expert scouts list, where basically almost the entire list is going to be having Vanguard. I'll talk about the ramifications of that kind of toward the end, but just to break it down really quickly, we have an Aristarch with Atlantis Spear and Expert Scouts, a unit of 3 Selenoi, a unit of 4 Agama with an Andromarchos. Almost certainly that's where the Aristarch is going. Another unit of 3 Selenoi, so 3 Scorpios. We then have a Polemarch with the Blades of Ecades and the Standard of Last Oration. He will be joining that Thorakides regiment, 4 strong once you account for the Minotaur Therian, which means that the Standard of Last Oration is going to be making that scoring. Then, almost certainly he's joining that unit of Thorakides. It would be very weird to have Last Oration if he wasn't. Then 5 Agama and a Talos. Now, I have played against a wider, lighter version of this list that ran like multiple MSU Agama, and how that version of this list played is you use things like the Selenoi with Vanguard movements to very aggressively push forward a reinforcement line, which the chariots can then arrive from. They swoop in off of the flanks very far up the field, and they're starting to shoot very, very early in the game. I think I like this version of the list more than the one that I've played against because it's got a Talos in it, it's got that like nice piece of durability, but it's also, rather than going quite as wide in terms of activations, it's concentrated its forces into just a few solid regiments that are actually one of the things that, like, when Agama are in an MSU, they are not making maximal use of the threat extension of fluid formation because there's just only so far forward you can push a little 3-inch regiment's corner to close the gap using fluid formation. Once you get to 4 or 5 stands, and we can see that once you add the characters, all 3 of these fluid formation regiments are 5 stands wide, which is the sweet spot for really maximizing that gap closing. You get like that real ability to threaten, and you have 2 Selenoi, which are nice range skirmishing regiments, and 3 war chariots. So this is I think probably the cleanest list of this type, this expert scouts archetype that I have seen city states play and build. And I think Dustin's built a really good list in that respect in terms of maximizing the use of expert scouts. Now, the question is, how well will that archetype do playing into the Chios meta? And in answering that question, I think that Talos is actually going to be astoundingly important. Because one of the weaknesses you can have with an expert scouts list is that it pushes you away from phalanx regiments, which pushes you away from kind of holding anvil space claiming pieces. The Talos does that for you. Now, he's not as durable as a really, really big unit of hoplites, but he's still very durable, and you need that durability to just create like an anchor point around which all of these mobile, ranged, dangerous regiments can play. And so I feel pretty comfortable saying, even though, like exactly as I said in the previous list, God, some interference would be nice. At least we do have multiple units with loose formation here, which helps against spellcasting. If you can get that Selenoi versus Karez matchup, for example, in the OD matchup, that's not too bad of a fight. I otherwise think this is probably the cleanest and probably best written version of this kind of list that I have seen. Um, how well it will play, like, does it have the edges to play into the Oops All Lights Were Drune? Honestly, I wouldn't be surprised in some cases it's got the reach to go and pick off like those, for example, in Benjamin's list, it may well have the reach to go and pick off like one or two of those three scoring units and start putting him in a really difficult spot. But it will, like, against really aggressive early rushes, I think it's going to have its work cut out for it. It's present on the board early, but it's going to have to hold like a small amount of territory. The strategic stack does really help in terms of just delaying your deployments and forcing your opponent to commit across a broader front, which could make a really big deal for it in this case. But I do think that will be a challenging game. I think winnable but challenging. And then, of course, you have the how well does it do into the oops all heavies? How well does this fight into 5 Karez, 10 Bone Golems, and Praetorian Guard? And I suspect it's probably wide enough and solid enough that it's playable in those cases. Not necessarily an easy fight. OD is never an easy fight for city states, even with some of their modern updates, but certainly playable. And so this, really happy to see this, as we don't just have three well-rounded city-states list, we have three well-rounded city-states list, the third of which is trying to do something a little bit different. So much like many lists that I've had a look at this afternoon, very interested to see how this one goes, and I think it's got quite a lot of potential, but you're always running a little bit of a risk with 40 points spent on expert scouts. It's an expensive upgrade. I think in this case that Dustin has done a really good job of leaning into the strengths without opening himself to some of the weaknesses that can come with this list archetype. And so, at last, finally, we get into the 100 Kingdoms, and there are 200 Kingdoms players. And they have like 18 stands of Ashen Dawn between the two of them, only 6 of which are located in this list. Spoiler alert. So this is Killian from France's 100 Kingdoms list, and we have a Sealed Temple and Imperial Officer Warlord list. So, a Priory Commander of the Sealed Temple, he has in his warband 2 units of Order of the Sealed Temple with Standard Bearers, 2 units of Ashen Dawn with Standard Bearers. We then have an Imperial Officer Warlord with no upgrades. He's kitted out to go into a melee regiment, so he, in addition to the 2 Mercenary Crossbowmen regiments in his list, will presumably be joining those Steel Legion. Then we have Mercenary Crossbowmen, and Hunter Cadre. Hunter Cadre are kitted out to take advantage of veterans. They're taking a Null Mage. It's an expensive regiment, but it gets them up to Volley 3 with Fiend Hunter, Vanguard, Unstoppable, etc. Barrage 3. They have both solid melee and solid range, which makes them kind of... Look, I don't know if those Hunter Cadre are good, but they're very cool, and I'm really glad to see them. We then have as our third warband, getting us up to, I think, 12 activations, despite the very expensive Priory Commander warband. We have a Chapter Mage. She is not a Warlord, no particular reason to be, because she's School of Fire. School of Fire opens up Fire Dart with Focused, just solid, ranged, offensive spellcasting, and with the Kiss Farewell, even though she's in a unit of Men-at-Arms, I really like this actually. Men-at-Arms will just sort of move forward. With just her shooting, the Men-at-Arms are perfectly serviceable as a semi-dangerous ranged unit. 7 shots with Volley 3, Deadly Shot at 18 inches of range is credible. Like, that's scary. Her throwing away with that enchanted crossbow/gun. And so that's a nice, clean little medium unit that can move up and score and take some shots. It can take advantage of Vanguard if it arrives on turn 2, using the Imperial, or even turn 3 to be perfectly frank, using the Imperial Officer's Warlord ability. But of course, the bulk of the play in this list is in this big first warband. So although we're running 3 light range units, Hunter Cadre and Mercenary Crossbowmen, really it's this warband where the action is. The Sealed Temple and the Ashen Dawn. 6 stands of Ashen Dawn is quite a lot. Usually I expect we'll see 1 unit turn up on turn 3 alongside the Steel Legion, which the Imperial Officer is giving flank to, and then we'll, 2/3 of the time we will see the 2nd unit of Ashen Dawn arrive on turn 4, by which point the entire army will have turned up. And we have just a good, well-rounded mix of solid heavy stuff and solid medium stuff and a bit of range. This is broadly, I would say, probably a not hugely optimized, but well-rounded 100 Kingdoms list. And not hugely optimized is where I'm going to have some gentle critique of this list, because I think it's doing some things that are cool, and I think it's making some interesting statements. But just to start with, banners on 100 Kingdoms Cavalry are probably too expensive. Like, yes, Unstoppable is a very good rule, but you're very fast, and you have fluid formation on all of the Order of the Sealed Temple. You should not usually be in positions where you are failing charges or needing to roll for charges too often. And those 4 standards are setting this army back 60 points. 60 points is a lot. And those 60 points are displacing some upgrades that could be really good elsewhere. One of the things I think it's criminal that this list is lacking is for 25 points you can give that Priory Commander Eccentric Fighting Style. That is such a good upgrade on Priory Commanders. It gives you full rerolls on all of your attacks, that includes the impact attacks, and it means that he has 8 attacks in melee with Flurry. Him in a unit of Order of the Sealed Temple is one of my personal favorite regiments in the entire game, because he's able to do so much damage from such a long way away with such reliability, and a lot of it is off the back of just how much extra damage you get from 25 points on Eccentric Fighting Style. And the downside of Eccentric isn't even particularly relevant, because yes, okay, in a duel it would theoretically mean that you would have to reroll your defense 4 rolls, but you have 8 attacks with Flurry and Quicksilver Strike, so you can just kill a lot of people in duels before you're even exposed to any attacks. In a similar vein, I would also say, look, there are enough spellcasters. I really like that Hunter Cadre regiment. I really like the idea that, you just get yourself in range and you cause enemy spellcasters to nuke themselves, and like a unit of Karez just does 6 wounds to itself, or like does 8 wounds to itself casting and kills 2 stands. I like the Null Mage. I don't know. And this is I don't know, right? I don't know if it's necessarily the right call. It's not too expensive. It's genuinely, this list does not have a lot of use for support +1 on everything, so veterans is probably the right call. And once we've committed to veterans being the right call, you get some mileage out of that. I do just question, look, is it the right choice? Is that Hunter Cadre unit the right choice? I want to hear about its adventures. I want to hear how it goes. I think it and those 2 crossbowmen are going to have to hang pretty far back against some of the lists that we are seeing. I don't think they will survive the attention of, for example, some of the Woodrune light regiments that are in play. They'll even struggle to win the ranged game against Sorcerer Kings. The threat disadvantage that Crossbowmen and Hunter Cadre have against things like Danho Disciples with homing wins is pretty telling, and that's fine with Mercenary Crossbowmen, they're cheap as chips, but those Hunter Cadre are expensive. So I do think there are some mild unoptimized elements in this list, but on the other hand, it is well rounded. It plays all parts of the game. Its heavy presence, its heavy regiments are good. Ashen Dawn are exceptional, and you really can't argue with 6 stands of Ashen Dawn or even 6 stands of Sealed Temple. Which brings us to, oh boy, Andrew Miller. Now, I haven't checked, but I have to assume that this list is from the United States. I don't think any other country in the world would field this, because it is a gross and blatant display of power that is nevertheless not exactly guaranteed to accomplish its objectives. This is, so 6 stands of Ashen Dawn is good. 12 stands, therefore, is even better. This is a good list. In fact, it's sort of grotesquely strong in some respects, but I want to just step back just a little bit from, oh god, that's 3 units of 4 Ashen Dawn, and actually address how carefully optimized some of this is. I made a point of saying in the previous list that I would really have liked to have seen Eccentric Fighting Style on the Priory Sealed Commander, because I think it's a fantastic upgrade. I am not going to say that in this army, because it is not possible to afford it. There are no upgrades anywhere in this list that are superfluous. Every single thing that is going on in this list is very, very clearly tailored toward the desire to accomplish putting 12 stands of Ashen Dawn on the list and on the table, and basically hoping that between them and the Sealed Temple, your game is being carried just mechanically by the maneuver of cavalry and impact of these pieces. So to go through what we have going on here, we have Prairie Commander, Sealed Temple, Sealed Temple, Sealed Temple, minimum units, 4 Ashen Dawn, 4 Ashen Dawn, Prairie Commander, Sealed Temple, 3 Sealed Temple, 4 Ashen Dawn, and then we have a Theist Priest with Focused in 3 Militia Bowmen. And I want to actually just pause and dwell on that last little warband as kind of important. This list, this is like, these are the cheapest possible warbands that you can run. There are 0 points spare. If you make the commitment of putting 12 stands of Ashen Dawn across 3 regiments on the table, this is the only way to do it with these points. You have exactly 190 points left over. I actually had a chat about this list with a mate who looked at it and went, "Ooh, that's a lot of Ashen Dawn." And my friend called out, "The like, is the Theist Priest actually like that useful? Surely that could be something better. Couldn't we make it into could we make it into a mage, for example? And then they could be a warlord." Like, no. So firstly, the Theist Priest isn't a warlord for a reason. There is no advantage to the Theist Priest being a warlord. It would only give up warlord points if it dies, because there's no way for the Theist Priest's warlord ability to interact with this list, and you can't have 2 Prairie Commander warlords. Secondly, there are only 190 points left in the entire list. There is, with the exception of like putting a noble in a unit of militia, there is nothing you can get that is 2 activations for that few points. And what that means is that the only way we can spend, like literally once we've committed to 12 Ashen Dawn across 3 regiments, the only way to fill the list out with this tiny number of points we have remaining is to take either a Theist Priest in militia, or a useless character in militia, or just take a 4th unit of Order of the Sealed Temple. Now, I would not hate a 4th unit of Order of the Sealed Temple, but I am an activation enjoyer, and to be honest, 9 activations is a little bit too few. It's a bit too few. Even I'm willing to embrace some jank, but let's get up to 10. And if you want to get up to 10 activations, this is literally it. This is the only way to do it. And the Theist Priest has some synergy. In addition to a focused Theist Priest actually being kind of a dangerous blaster, like those militia will evaporate. If anything looks at those militia, they are off the table. But the Theist Priest has a meaningful buffing spell. Saint's Favor can put Order of the Ashen Dawn up to Defense 5. And that's terrifying. Like, and it's very easy for him to cast it as well. Priest 6 with focused and no scaling means that even through interference, he's usually going to succeed. Which means that, yeah, you can absolutely have a unit of Order of the Ashen Dawn that, for 1 turn only, is Defense 5, Resolve 6, effectively, Fearless, 6 wounds, Blessed, Hardened 1. That seems difficult to kill. And yeah, I realize that I'm spending a lot of time talking about a 190 point Theist Priest in Militia Bowman when the rest of the list speaks for itself. You don't need me to talk about the rest of the list. It's 12 stands of Ashen Dawn. This is the most gear check in Isle 6 list that is at this event by a wide margin, including the Old Dominion lists. It is really, really hoping that Ashen Dawn are broken. Because if Ashen Dawn aren't broken, then this list is kind of up shit's creek. And so, look, for that reason, I very much respect the Chutzpah. I It's possible that this list can win the event. I don't expect it to, because at some point it's going to run into an opposing force that can kill it. I think some of the Old Dominion lists may well be able to, even as powerful as Ashen Dawn are. I think it's possible that some of the middle range lists can engage this. I think it's possible that some of the light focus lists. If this list hits the wrong Wardrune list in Maelstrom, it may just never get far enough into the game. It'll just get pinned back. The fight will take too long, and it sort of won't be able to get onto zone. Possibly, right? Like, these are hypothetical situations. But I do think that this list will absolutely run into a few people who have looked at it intellectually and gone, yeah, that's very dangerous. And then when confronted with the reality of these Ashen Dawn, and it's like, oh god, he's passed his reinforcement rolls and they've all arrived, and the gang's all here on turn 3, and like the nightmare scenario. So I expect this list to do what skew lists do, which is, over a 4-round event, ruin the day of maybe 2 out of 4 people. I think it is absolutely possible that it may be able to perform better than that, but my overall expectation with regards to the skill of the players at Chios is that at least half of them, right, you would think should be sufficiently prepared to deal with skew of this magnitude. So I think it is very good. I think it is very scary. I think it's excellent that it's at Chios because it's kind of right to me that whoever wins the event should say, yeah, I won an event, and yes, there was a list with 12 Ashendorn in there. That's not going to exist in, a month. Certainly not without a considerable number of sacrifices, anyway. But I wouldn't want to rule it out winning the event. I don't think it will. I think if this list wins the event, either it's gotten very lucky, or I have overestimated the quality of players at the event, and I don't think I have. But it's possible, firstly, that Andrew is a genius and knows how to play this really, really well, or more likely, I suspect this list will do well. I don't think it will win. If I see this on the podium, I will not be remotely surprised. And honestly, turning up to Chios and podiuming, that's a pretty damn good outcome. So while I am constitutionally obligated not to wish Andrew the best of luck, I do think, look, this list is absolutely fearsome. I think it's named very, very well for a reason. I think it's going to put the fear of God into at least some people, and I look forward to hearing how it does. Now, huh. Pause for breath, 2.5 hours later, that is every list at the Road to Chios World Championship covered in probably excessive detail. I do hope you've enjoyed this. I do Conquest videos only occasionally, but it is the second of two games that I play primarily. I enjoy it very much, and I enjoy talking about it very much. It's a game that lends itself to some really crunchy discussion in the same way that it lends itself to some really crunchy play. From here, I can only wish all of the participants at Chios the absolute very best of luck, except maybe for that 12 Ashen Dawn list, where I hope it rolls at best averagely the entire event, because it would be gross to play into that if it was rolling like well on its reinforcement rolls, for example. But no, look, in seriousness, good luck to everyone. I hope you have a fantastic time. I look forward to seeing photographs. I look forward to hearing the adventures of a variety of different interesting lists and units. I think, although there is a little bit of spikiness, the faction diversity that is present with every faction playing, even though it's only a 16-person event, is awesome. And the diversity of lists present, playing the high end and the top end of Conquest, we are seeing a real variety of metas that are present at the event and which will be pitted against each other. So it's going to be awesome to hear how things go. I look forward to seeing updates, and I hope everyone else is looking forward to that as well. As always, if you like what I'm doing here and you enjoyed this video and you'd like to support the channel, you can do so via the Buy Me a Coffee link at the video description below, or by becoming a channel member or long-term supporter via Buy Me a Coffee. Big thanks to everyone who has so far. I take requests for video topics, battle report factions, etc. from channel supporters of all types. Otherwise, although Conquest on this channel is only something that I will do occasionally, Infinity is my main game. I hope very much that everyone enjoyed this, and I will see you at some point in the future for more content, or you can keep an eye on goonhammer.com where I write. You'll see my takes on on Conquest, including the update that is coming. We'll almost certainly be publishing stuff about that, so you'll be able to see that there. Otherwise, hope very much you enjoyed this, and I'll see you next time.